This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 10, and that's rather gratifying, actually. Liam, you're very hilarious. Liam writes, is it the one about you stealing records from Woolworths while on your lunch break from a building site? No, it's not that one. It's when we first moved to Kidderminster, and my dear departed father wanted to treat my sister and I to a little gift, because we had been uncharacteristically well behaved during the long drive down from Yorkshire. And he went to the department store, Owen and Owens. It wasn't Beatty's, actually, as Andrew suggests. That could have been, though. That was the local department store in Wolverhampton, but we were in Kidderminster, where the department store was Owen. And he went in the first time, sort of as a resident of the Midlands, bordering on the Black Country, where the accents can sometimes be as thick as treacle. And he went into the shop. I haven't thought of this in years, until James came on at the end there with Nick from Wolverhampton talking about ties. So he went into the department store and he asked for directions to the toy department. He asked the shop assistant that he encountered on his way in to point him to the toy department, because he wanted to buy 2 toys, one for me, one for my sister. And so she said, yes, over there, sir, just turn left at the trousers. And so he walked over there and he finds himself in the middle of the menswear department. You've worked out what's happened here, right? So he's sort of looking, wanders back over and says, sorry, I was looking for the toys. She goes, yes, they're there, sir, the toys. They're just there. The things that you wear around your neck, pronounced in a Kidderminster accent. Toys. Well, it made me laugh anyway. 5 minutes. And a very gratifying number of you actually knew that. It's similar to the kipper toy joke. Kipper tie, cup of tea, but not exactly the same. I don't know. There's not a story this morning that's absolutely demanding our attention in the way that the farmers did yesterday. But the one that's got me uneasy and unhappy is the report, finally, into how many people the winter fuel cut could push into poverty. The overall figure is 100,000. It's not, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not quite as clear cut as you might like, as you might want. Well, for 2 reasons. The first is that the figures are rounded to the nearest 50,000. So you don't know quite what is the nearest 50,000 to 1,000. It's 50,000, isn't it? Or would it be 26,000? But anyway. And the second bit is that the impact does not take into account the people who have claimed pension credit since the government's campaign last year. That's quite an obfuscatory fact, because you could theorise that a huge number of pensioners eligible for the credit who weren't previously claiming it realised they were eligible for it and claimed it, and came out of the introduction of the winter fuel allowance reduction actually better off than they went into it, because if you are eligible for the credit, not only will it mean that you don't have to suffer the winter fuel cut, you'll also get the credit as well. So you see what I mean? I think that's pretty straightforward. You come out of it better off than you went into it, but we don't know. And I don't know how much it matters, because the headline remains, winter fuel cut could put 100,000 in poverty. And this is, where is the number, do you think, that would make this policy intolerable? How many old age pensioners are you comfortable seeing pushed into poverty? Because I can be a bit naive, as you know, in my politics, certainly in my political thinking. And there's a large part of me that wants to say that a Labour government shouldn't be pushing a single pensioner into poverty. The definitions of poverty are clear. It's the percentage of median income. So relative and absolute poverty, 50,000 in each by the end of the decade, according to the figures published in a letter from Liz Kendall. Now, there's no one in the building to whom I can turn at the moment and say, does this make sense? Radio 4 has programmes that crunch these numbers, that are dedicated to these kind of things. I am not qualified to present a programme like that. We don't have an economics editor, for example. But the fact that it's been put on the front page of a couple of newspapers today, newspapers that come from very different political perspectives, the I newspaper, which, as I've said to you a few times, I find myself turning to increasingly often first in the morning. That goes in with the extra 100,000 pensioners in poverty after winter fuel cut. The government's controversial decision to axe payment for all but the poorest pensioners will directly push 100,000 retirees into relative poverty between now and 2030. And as you would expect, newspapers that are less sympathetic historically to the Labour government also weighed in on this story. The Daily Telegraph has it on its front page. I've been what's the word? I suppose you'd call it a honeymoon period. The sense of relief that accompanies the passage into Downing Street of people who aren't insane was palpable for a while, wasn't it? I appreciate there are still many, many fans of insanity out there. The Donald Trump, the Brexit, the Boris Johnson, the Liz Truss faction, call it what you will. But for those of us who just like our politics to be at least adjacent to the truth, for those of us who don't recognise alternative facts or will never understand how somebody like Nadine Dorries could have ended up as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, then the passage into Downing Street of this government was a moment of relief, a moment of repose almost. I would have felt the same if it had been a Dominic Grieve type government or a David Gauke type government. If the kind of Conservatives that were removed from the parliamentary party for having the audacity to tell the truth about things in 2019, if they had found their way back into Downing Street, there'd have been a similar sense of relief. It's not an entirely tribal or partisan position. I felt a little bit like that, as you know, for 3 or 4 hours when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. I just thought, oh, thank goodness, they're not going to tell us that black is white. They're not going to tell us that we can't go to our best friend's funeral because of COVID while having drunken parties in their own office space, in the building where the Prime Minister actually lives, some parties that the Prime Minister himself has actually attended. They're not going to look us in the eye and tell us that up is down, that war is peace, that freedom is slavery and all the rest of it. So there was that little bit of relief that, I don't like the phrase the grown-ups because it I don't know how much heft it carries, but you know of what I speak, all right? The sense that the people in charge were not delinquent or depraved or deeply, deeply, deeply dishonest. But you've got to be careful, you know? You've got to be careful not to let the honeymoon period brainwash you. Just because you're relieved that people who seem at least to care about the truth are now in charge doesn't mean you give them a green light or you wave them through on everything. I've been waiting for this moment. I've been waiting for these figures to be clarified, and they're not as clear as they could be, as I've explained to you. That failure to take into account that the people signing up for it are new. So it goes with the numbers that were in place prior to that campaign. But I think it's disgusting. I'm comfortable with the targeting of people who have more at the moment in pursuit of the funds that we need to do more. In the context of the farmers, again, you know, it could be clearer. The distinction between people who work the land and people who just buy it to avoid tax perhaps could be made more clear. But as a fundamental principle, I'm not going to be getting my tiny violins out for people who have got £10 million estates and claim that they can't actually make a decent living from that asset. You need to have a rethink. That's life. But on this one, I'm deeply disturbed by the idea of a Labour government pushing pensioners into poverty. Deeply disturbed. And I want to know whether you are as well. And I almost wonder how you couldn't be on a day like today. These people are very fallible. Everybody's fallible. Humans are fallible. The worst thing about extreme politics is that people imbue their heroes with infallibility. And then, of course, when they prove to be fallible, when they lie through their teeth, when they're caught with their trousers down or adjudicated to be a rapist in a courtroom, they just gloss over it. They ignore it. They turn away. And that goes right up to the top of the commentariat, you know. People bet so much upon political heroes that they can't ever turn around and say, hang on a minute, this is really bad. This is really bad. How many pensioners are there in total? Millions. It's a tiny percentage. I think it might be 0.6% of all the pensioners, this figure. But I think it's too much. I think it's too much. I think 0.6 is too much. The problem, I suppose, is this. Any cut-off point is going to hurt. And any cut-off point is going to have winners and losers. The idea, well, I talked yesterday about how difficult it is to do tapers, and then I discovered that actually when it comes to inheritance tax, there is a taper, but that's a much easier taper to introduce. It's not like a guillotine. You pass on over a certain amount, it is eligible for an inheritance tax. If you pass it on 7 years before you die, you're golden. Your heir will not be eligible for any inheritance tax. But if you die in that period in between, if you die during those 7 years, then you pay less accordingly. So you pay a fraction, a proportion of the 20% for farmers, 40% for everybody else. If you die after 2 years, your heir pays a proportion of that. If you die after 4 years, the proportion is smaller. If you die after 6 years, it's smaller still. So you can do tapers on some financial measures, but you can't really do it on this. The big one, of course, was when they abolished child benefit for people who earn over a certain amount, and so it would be one income. So you could have two people earning, for the sake of argument, I can't remember the exact figures, two people earning 49 grand a year each, both working, a joint income of £98,000 would be eligible for the child benefit, but the person next door, one income, as one parent stays at home and one parent goes out to work and they earn £50,000, they wouldn't get it. So yeah, you can see how these things can be clumsy, perhaps inevitably. But here is the example. This is what I've got. Thank you, Laura. I'm 19 pence over the limit to get pension credit. I have no income other than the state pension and a £15 a month council pension. It adds up to £873 a month. I'm already struggling. I'm rationing food and I'm rationing heating, and I am not alone. I am astonished and aggrieved that the Labour government has cut my winter fuel payment. It's unbelievable. That is who I'm talking about. Right there. I don't know if there are 50,000 Lauras in the country. I know that there are not 50,000 Lauras listening to this programme. That would just be impossible. Or even 100,000, which is the total figure. But those words, they really sing, right? I am astonished and aggrieved that a Labour government would do this. So I know that to have a full picture of this, you would need to have the numbers. I know that the plural of anecdote is not data. I know that the top end of pensioners likely to fall into this category is going to be about 1% of the overall total. And I know that we don't normally deal in the politics of absolutism, in binary politics together. We try to be an antidote to that. But I think it's still too much. And I at the moment, I really don't like it. Because I always slightly bowdlerise King Lear at this point. There's a scene in King Lear where the daughters are debating over how many soldiers King Lear gets to keep after they've essentially sort of castrated him, metaphorically speaking. And it's one of the most callous and cutting lines in the whole of the canon, when either Goneril or Regan, I can never remember which one, sort of says essentially, she says, what need one? She's sort of saying, why do you even need one soldier? And this is the opposite of that. I don't think you can excuse one pensioner being put into the position that Laura describes. I can't anyway. So what's the question? Am I going mad? I mean, is it just the case that with anything that is designed to raise funds, there are going to be Laura's out there. There are going to be people who are, sadly, right in the eye of the storm. And to use the language of the right wing, you just have to suck it up. Or is this something that a Labour government should not be countenancing? How naive does that make me sound? How undergraduate, how studenty? I don't know. I honestly don't know. How do you see this policy, and how do you greet the news that a Labour government, elected at least in part as an antidote to the cruelty and the callousness of the last 14 years, the austerity years, is poised to push pensioners into relative poverty? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. And if you are Laura, well, actually, if you're literally Laura, but if you are like Laura, I do want to hear from you as well. The challenge for the rest of us today is to work out whether or not this tiny proportion of pensioners should be enough to banjax the whole project. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. Thoughtful one today. I mean, there may be an opportunity to ring in and scream about how much you hate me, but I don't think so. But I don't want to tempt fate. But you see what I mean, I think. What do you reckon on this one? And is it time for those of us who have been warm and optimistic with regard to the Labour government, is it time for us to say this one's wrong, lads and ladesses? This one actually stinks. 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 10 is the time. Listen, I get quite a few messages like this on days like today. This is from Stephen. I have no reason to doubt him. He writes, this morning my mother was once again telling me how much she is going to struggle without her winter fuel allowance, just as she was setting off for her 7th holiday of the year. We're not talking about your mum today. We're talking about Laura, who it gets 19 pence too much to qualify for the pension credit that would exonerate her, exempt her. So just tell me what you think of this policy. Ray is in Whitstable. Ray, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Wonderful to talk to you at last. I've tried to get on your programme before. It's a great pleasure to talk to you.
There you go. Good things come to those who wait, Ray.
Exactly. As you can tell from my voice, I'm a working class pensioner.
How can I tell that from you? I can't. You're not like, I'd have to chop your leg off and count the rings or something like that. I can't tell how old you are or what class you are. But anyway, I'll take your word for it.
We are 66 this year.
Right.
We've just been told we will not get it. We're just getting our state pensions.
Right.
And I'm glad because we do not need it.
Yeah.
I want that money to go towards the health service and where it is needed because this previous government has ruined this country. So I'm glad to lose the money. Now, as I tell you, your researcher, where I live, I'm surrounded by pensioners. We know many, many, many pensioners. And having talked to them, there are obviously the majority of them do not need the money. I asked one last year, what do you need it for? She said, it goes towards one of my holidays. I saw a pensioner driving around the other day in an orange Porsche. We've seen pensioners in Aston Martins.
Yeah, well, I know.
The majority of people here do not need it.
The massive majority of people don't need it. So,
exactly.
But we're talking about the ones who we could make quite a strong case for them that they do need it, and they are going to be pushed into relative poverty. And is that enough to turn you against the whole policy?
Well, we do have met people, and they are basically, they said, no, we do need it. But the majority, as I said, out of the 10 million, I think 9 million probably do not need it. So let's talk about those who do need it.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why these pensioners are already in poverty, not the Labour government, is because the previous Tory government throws the tax threshold at £12,500. So if you are a pensioner and your only income, let's say, is £13,500, you're not rich, you're quite poor. You pay £200 now in tax. So the previous Tory administration gave you the money and took it back through taxation. So they have put thousands of pensioners in fuel poverty. But this did not make the front page of the right-wing trash newspapers, who weren't worried about that. They weren't worried that pensioners were dying last year because of something a Tory government did.
This is true.
So to blame
I mean, the
Labour
figures
for all
the
this-
figures are published annually. The deaths that are related to pensioners being cold are published annually. And you're right, they don't make the front pages until Labour bring in a policy like this.
Exactly. So why are we blaming the Labour Party for this when the Tories have already... They've already done it. They've already... If you want to believe that pensioners have died because of the cold and thousands have died, the previous administration have already done it.
But in a way,
Ray,
Ray,
the blame.
in a way, this is my point, though, isn't it? Is that I know everything that you've just said is true, but I wanted this lot to be profoundly different, and they are going to make things worse for this admittedly very small cohort of people, and I just need convincing that they've got no choice, I suppose.
Well, the good thing is that in 2028, Rachel Reeves, I know it's 3 years away, or 4 years away, has said she's going to raise the tax thresholds, and that will take pensioners out of poverty.
Yes, that's true as well.
Just by doing that. And that is a way to do it, to raise the tax thresholds so poor people and poor pensioners won't be living in poverty. I mean, I understand why they've done this winter fueling, because 90% of pensioners don't need it. Well, I mean, why should you give it to Paul the Venels?
Yes, I mean, that is very persuasive. I mean, obviously it's persuasive, but is it enough? It is for you, clearly, and it might be for me by 11 o'clock today, but it just, I don't know why, it just makes me uneasy this morning. Can I clarify one thing? Was it the Porsche that was offensive, or the fact that it was orange?
It was the fact that there was probably a 75-year-old man driving it. I wanted to wind the window down and shout through, "Excuse me, do you need the winter fuel payment?" And if not, I would say one thing, James. Why aren't these people not ringing up who do not need it?
Well, they are. No, I can know that. Well, you're here now. You're literally talking to... I've got loads of people like that. That's never a problem. And you know, this programme happily is a kind of honeypot for people who are proud, or at least who recognise that they should be paying a little bit more. But obviously, it's not them about whom we're talking first and foremost today. The other response, of course, as Mark points out, is just to tell them to suck it up, like the self-employed. 3 million people during COVID were told just to suck it up. They didn't get help by furlough. Every single policy will affect someone in a way that's suboptimal. You've just got to roll with the waves. And that might be true. And that's why I've used the word naive this morning, or soppy, or studenty. And I still feel that way. Thank you, Ray. Ben's in Hemel Hempstead. Ben, what do you think?
Well, I'm 71, and I only live on my state pension.
Yes.
I've done the government thing, and I come out the same as Laura, a few pence over the cut-off line. And to be honest, I've had enough. I voted Labour one last time because I'm way to the left of Starmer.
Yes.
And I went into the election, and I stood for 15 minutes trying to decide whether to give them my vote one last time. And in the end I did, and they screwed me. First act they did was true.
Was to take away your winter fuel allowance. I just to clarify, you should, if the only income you've got is the state pension and you're 71, you should qualify for the pension credit.
No. I've been on the government website, I've done the questionnaire.
Have you found the helpline?
Yeah.
That's the only income you've got is the state pension. You've got no other private pension. You've got no other income at all.
No. Because I spent the last 8 years of my working life caring for both my parents.
Right.
And all my savings went. And I cashed in my pensions to what's the word?
I don't know.
Get rid of my credit card debt.
Oh.
And to be honest, as I said to your producer, if euthanasia was available, I'd take it, because this is no way to live.
So tell me how you are living.
I eat once a day, buying the cheapest food available. My electricity bill has gone up from £19 a month before the Ukrainian thing. It's now £65 a month.
Wow.
My standing, I'm in sheltered accommodation. I have to pay a standing charge. That's gone up from £50 a month to £70 a month. I've had enough. This This is no way to live, James.
And you've been living like this for a while, and it's going to get worse when you lose your winter fuel allowance.
It gets worse every year.
So I think you cancel out, Ray, Ben. I know it's no comfort to you. It's not going to put any. It's not going to put any pennies in the meter. But a Labour government should not be doing this, should they?
No. And I get fed up with this argument. Oh, because the rich don't need it, I can't have it.
Well, there's always going to be a cut-off. But I mean, I hesitate to sort of get all technical when we're talking about your life, and you're clearly in such a hole. But there has to be a point at which people don't get it. But the point, I think, is too low, isn't it? If you're beneath
I think
it.
So. Yeah. Example, I can have my eyes tested for free because I'm a pensioner.
Right.
But because I don't get pension credit, I can't get free spectacles. I can't afford to buy them.
Everyone is telling me that you should be getting the pension credit. If that is, I don't know whether the fact that you had a private pension and you cashed it in would have affected your situation. But
no. Everyone's telling me. I have been on the government.
I know. I believe you, Ben. I'm just kind of hoping that we've made a mistake. Is all that you.
And it keeps coming back and saying no.
Okay. I think it's worth ringing the phone line again and just going through it all with. I'm not. There will be people in the situation, but Laura has a very small council pension, and she's 19 pence over the threshold. So, in the absence of that very small council pension, there's no way that she would be over the threshold in the way that you are.
I don't know.
Well, I think it's worth giving them a ring. What have you got to lose?
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Seriously.
Thanks for listening anyway,
Well,
James.
I'll always listen. I just wish I could do more sometimes. But I usually got quite a reliable inbox. People who've been through what you've been through or who know more about it than I do. And there's unanimous at the moment that you should be able to get that credit. I really hope you do. We'll check in, I think. 10:32 is the time. But let's say he doesn't, right? Or that Laura, with 19 pence over the threshold, Labour shouldn't be doing this. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
35, you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and of course you've got the other. It's not an anomaly necessarily, but the date upon which you retired will have an effect on your eligibility for the pension credit as well. But I want to nail the politics of it. We tried yesterday with the farmers to look at the politics. How it impacts upon people who won't be directly affected by it, but the politics of it. Listen, it's not going to make me vote for any of the alternatives at the moment, but it's going to leave a very unpleasant taste in my mouth if it turns out that this policy is pushing people like Ben and Laura and others into relative poverty. And I don't find myself comforted by the thought that someone always gets hurt. You know, there's always going to be some people for whom it feels a bit unfair. But wherever you draw the line, that will be true, unless you draw no line at all. I think I've articulated that position quite well, but it is more feeling than fact. And the plural of anecdote is not data. And the figure is estimated to be about 0.6% of the total number of pensioners. And in most contexts, I'd say that's not enough to sabotage the whole policy. But in this context, I think perhaps it might be. Louise is in Chester-le Street. Louise, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James.
Hello.
I'm nervous this time. I wasn't last time.
Okay. Oh, I'm interested now. Go on.
Because I've been waiting, so I've been thinking about it.
Oh.
I'm more frustrated with how they bring this in.
Yes.
Why didn't they make sure everyone who's entitled to pension credit is on it first?
They've tried to do, don't turn me into a spin doctor, but they have tried to do that, and these figures do not take into account that campaign. So we don't know yet how successful. I think we did get a figure, but it's not in these figures.
Even before they announced it, they were trying, were they?
Yeah.
Right. See,
no, not before they announced it. They kind of went hand in hand. They announced it and then launched a massive campaign to get all the people. I think there's about 100,000 people.
They should have done that first before even tweaking with the winter fuel payment. Make sure everybody who's entitled to whatever they can get is getting it. Then later on down the line, next year, maybe start tweaking with the winter fuel allowance, the payment. because obviously it needs to change because everyone's getting it, and that's just ridiculous. But I just think it's the way they're working, that they're not thinking things through. And then it has this kind of negative effect and all these headlines when I don't think that was.
How would we have
necessary.
avoided them? Because I think I'm going to argue with you very politely about the campaign, because I think that they'd have to say this is coming in order to sort of push people into doing the paperwork. Do you see what I mean? You could have a campaign saying, "Oh, by the way, you might be eligible to some money, to some help." Or you could have a campaign saying, "We're taking something away from you, but it's highly possible that you're actually entitled to more than we're about to take away." I just think that's part of the catalyst for getting people to do it in the first place.
But tweak it next year. Stop it next year, not this year, so people have had time to adjust and make sure everyone who's entitled to it gets it. It was done they announced it and it was like this big grey cloud hanging over people for months.
Yes.
And it still didn't give them enough time to look at their finances and poor Ben.
Yeah.
I mean, oh God.
That's just not right, is it?
This isn't Labour.
No, it's not.
Labour. And this is what's getting me frustrated. Last time I was angry about his suits and what have you.
You were, the Keir Starmer suits.
Because I said I found it depressing.
It's a dread word, optics. They always talk about optics.
Oh, don't talk about optics.
I don't like optics, but I know that's what you mean, though.
I always think of gin and tonic.
I like that. Yes, I'll have a large one. What we're talking about is the tension between principle and policy, and you could agree with something in principle, but you don't think that it is being intelligently implemented in the case of this policy.
Yeah, that's it.
I think you're right, and you could mean the throwaway line that I don't know if you noticed is that obviously not everybody should be getting it. And so that's the bit on which almost everybody agrees. And yet they've managed to...
Yeah.
And that's why I'm focusing on newspapers that are ordinarily quite straight with the public, that are quite, benefit of the doubt with either government. And they are framing the headlines that you describe.
Yeah.
This is a tough one. So, I mean, I don't know what they can do now. I don't know whether...
They've messed it up.
They have.
They've messed it up. But I hope they learn for the next tranche of changes they want to bring in. I hope they learn.
Well, I suppose that the inheritance tax for farmers, albeit that it's rather harder to muster up sympathy for someone with a £4.5 million estate than it is for Ben, also could be susceptible to the argument that it could have been done more intelligently. Thank you, Louise. I don't know what you were nervous about. 10:41 is the time. And that word optics is sort of how things look. So Keir Starmer did nothing wrong. The receipt of largesse from his colleague Wahid Ali was absolutely not in breach of any rules. And the only reason we know about it is because it was declared fully and transparently. And compared to the hospitality, did we ever find out who paid for Boris Johnson's Caribbean trip? I don't know that we ever found out who picked up that bill. So, I mean, the comparison is absurd. What Starmer did wasn't even a 1 on the scale of offence where Boris Johnson routinely scored 10s. But you expect better. That's the point. You expect better. If you're going to breathe a sigh of relief that you've got rid of the depravity, the delinquency, the dishonesty, then you kind of almost need to be whiter than white. And that's the problem. And is that unfair? I don't know. Is that a bit shit? That's why I talk about being an undergraduate. That's why I wonder whether this is almost sort of self-flagellation, making rods for your own back by complaining that your people aren't perfect when the other lot were almost professionally imperfect. Sue's in Thurrock. Sue, what do you think?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, first thing I'd like to say is, as far as Ben's concerned, to get in touch with Age UK.
Yes, very good advice.
Yeah,
and his energy supplier as well. They might be able to help. But a lot of things he can do. But he felt like he didn't have the energy, didn't he? I hope he's listening.
No,
and I hope
right,
he does.
Yeah, but I think Age UK would probably have a bit more empathy, maybe, than the government.
Yes.
Phone lines.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. But
although just for people listening, I'm not interrupting you. For people listening, I am told by a few people that on this one, the phone line is actually really helpful. It's essentially just getting people, talking them through how they fill in the paperwork. But it may be that he doesn't qualify. I think the fact that he's 71 made me think that he would. But anyway, on we go.
Okay. Yeah, I have to agree with your last caller as well, and yourself, when it's about the implementation. I don't think there's anything wrong with actually means testing the £200 or £300 fuel allowance, because there are people that don't need it.
Yes.
But I mean, if Labour had said, right, okay, anybody that's in the 40% tax bracket doesn't get it this year, that might have been a better way to start it. And
wouldn't
then
have raised enough. It wouldn't have raised enough, they would say. But and then next year they could have changed it a bit. The SNP are saying that no, I beg your pardon. The Scottish Labour government has said it would put in place a means-tested winter fuel payment equivalent if it is elected in 2026. So, Scottish Labour have managed to frame a policy that you're describing, but Westminster Labour have not.
Yeah, but it just seems to be a sledgehammer to crack a nut. At the, very, very quickly after coming into power. I mean, in terms of fuel poverty, I think, sort of a lot of those, I'm not justifying it in any way, but the 0.6%, there would still be people in that cohort that would be in poverty even with that £200 or £300 a year.
That's very true. And there will be people who are going to have the temperature on their death certificate. It's going to be linked to cold, who could actually have afforded to turn the heating on, but are frightened to do so, or have boxed themselves into uncomfortable corners. The numbers are never going to be completely crystal clear, but is it enough? It is, I sense. Well, it clearly is enough for you to... We balk at this, I think, Sue. We balk at this policy, even if it is only affecting a tiny number of people in the way that we're describing.
We do, and I'll be honest, this last election is the first time in my life that I've ever voted Labour.
Really?
Yeah. Because I was just sick of the horrible rhetoric and the cruelty and just nastiness of the last 14 years. And I can understand that, they've had difficult decisions to make. I just don't think they went about it in the right way. Just the idea of maintaining a temperature in your home that is not freezing should perhaps have been a little bit higher up on the priorities than the sums and the calculations. And again, it's about how it feels. And as Jamie points out, you might not like the word optics, but they can do for a politician at least as effectively as policies, if not more. Thank you, Sue.
James O'Brien on LBC.
48 is the time, and I suppose we have to add into the mix that the state pension is due to rise by about £400 a year next April, which would cancel out the loss of the winter fuel allowance. But obviously, the two things are not intrinsically linked. You are still losing your winter fuel allowance, and your pension would have gone up anyway. Pension's going to go up whether you're losing your winter fuel allowance or not. So it could, I suppose the question is, and the media very rarely troubles itself with complications like this, how could it have been done differently? Scottish Labour say that they can bring in a taper, they can bring in a means test that would be fairer than this. But immediately I get a message from someone like Claire, who tells me that she is, not Claire, yes, it is from Claire, who tells me that she is eligible for it. But if you say that only 40% taxpayers should lose it, it doesn't take into account households like mine. I don't pay any taxes. I only have my state pension. And my other half does. He has a good private pension, but I still get the winter fuel payment. As a household, we obviously don't need it. And you wouldn't lose it under that means testing. So I don't know. Are we letting the perfect be the enemy of the good? I find that a really helpful phrase sometimes, but it feels very cold and unhuman when you apply it to people like Laura, our first texter this morning, and Ben, an earlier caller. 10:50 is the time. Philip is in Leigh on the Solent. Philip, what would you like to say?
Yes, hello, James.
Hello.
Good morning to you.
Hello.
I think your last few callers have sort of hit the nail on the head in some respects.
Have that. I mean, they not to criticise my callers, but we all feel similarly. But can we actually assemble a substantive alternative that's workable?
Yeah, I can't believe that between DWP and HMRC, they don't know the income levels of virtually everybody in this country. And it seems to me the simple method, rather than getting people to fill out great big forms for means testing, is that it's dealt with via HMRC and or in conjunction with the DWP. And so quite simply, if you have a certain income, you don't get it. Underneath that level, you get it. And I think that would be fair and equitable.
I don't know whether I'd have responded to that once by saying it's highly unlikely, Philip, that the galaxy brains in the Treasury wouldn't have occurred to them while it's popping into your head in Leon the Solent. But that would be both a little bit rude and also not necessarily true. I mean, it may well be that there is a better way of doing it, and they have either rejected it for the wrong reasons or not adopted it for reasons currently indiscernible to us. Can't think why.
Point you make.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that. Well, listen. This is what Anas Sarwar says, the Scottish Labour leader. They will introduce a devolved payment if it wins the Scottish Parliament election in 2026. Yeah. All pensioners would receive the payment initially, but it would be tapered over the years to reflect the income of recipients, with those who are better off receiving less in the longer term. That's kind of what you're describing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the reverse way of doing it, isn't it?
Yes.
Everybody gets it, and then they just increase the tax level on those above a certain income level to claw it back.
And then taper it off.
Vice versa, really.
I mean, we shall find out. Keep an eye on this. Thank you. Nice to talk about it nice to have the luxury of talking about it in the crucible of contemplation and consideration, rather than just shouting awful or brilliant at each other. But at the moment, I think the sense is that the price we're being asked to pay is too high. The price that people like Ben and Laura and others are being asked to pay is actually too high. How feasible would it be for the government to have a better handle on everybody's financial situation and therefore taper it differently? And if it means that Claire gets it even though she doesn't need it as a household, then that becomes the wrinkle that you will always have. There'll always be somebody on the right or the wrong side of the measure, of the metric, of the policy. And I'd rather have a few people getting it who don't need it than a few people not getting it who do. That makes sense, right? Reg is in Richmond. Reg, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that I'm 84 years old and I've voted Labour all my life, and I don't know if I'll survive long enough for the next election, but if I do, and if Keir Starmer is still leading the party, I certainly won't vote Labour.
And over this policy, is it?
Over this policy and other stuff.
Sure.
I mean, this policy, I mean, like you, I was thrilled when Labour got in. I was thrilled that it was a landslide.
Yes.
And I thought, my goodness, now's the opportunity to really do some genuinely good socialist things. And the first thing that they do is get rid of the winter fuel allowance payment. And I've got a small company pension of £240 a month, so
and that pushes you over the threshold.
It pushes me over, so I don't qualify. And I'm a jam. I'm just about managing.
Yes.
I will manage without the winter payment. But it was the first thing I saw, and I thought, I can't believe if the Tories had done it, I would have thought, well, this is typical Tory and rational. But I think of Labour as a more emotional.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? It's the size of the net, Reg. Because if the Tories had done it, we can both sit here now and say the Tories never would have done it, because it would have involved taking money away from the richest pensioners in the country, and they weren't going to do that in a million years. But it feels as if the net's too big, and it's caught you, and you shouldn't be in it.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I'll get by, and it'll all be fine. But I mean, as I say, I'm just totally disillusioned and so disappointed.
So who should it have caught then? How could we have? How would we assemble our net in a way that doesn't catch people we don't think should be caught by this? Because I'm not to make excuses for anybody, because I don't like it any more than you do. But I'm just wondering about the plausibility of alternatives.
I think it would have been if I were leading a Labour Party. It's not that I've ever been that political, but if I were leading a Labour Party,
it'd be quite a career change at this stage in your life, Reg.
It would. Oh God! But if it were possible for people to opt out, do you know what I mean? Rather than be cut out. So in other words, anyone who would welcome it could keep it, and anyone who didn't want it could opt out. But going back to Keir Starmer, if I may,
yeah, of course you may.
I mean, the next thing that happened for me was that, £20,000 worth of clothes or whatever.
Yes.
And I thought, my God, this is Boris Johnson stuff. This isn't what I expect. I want to be inspired by a leader. I don't want to be.
I think that was an appalling mistake. I can sit here till I'm blue in the face pointing out that it's nothing like what Boris Johnson did, but it feels like it is, and that's enough, isn't it?
Absolutely. And without wanting to sort of get into a Boris Johnson, is terrible or Boris Johnson is wonderful debate, Boris was a charismatic leader for the Conservatives.
Yes.
And Keir Starmer is not a charismatic leader for Labour.
No.
That's what's so disappointing. For me, he is the most disappointing leader Labour has ever had in my lifetime.
I don't care about charisma, actually, but what you describe is the ability to overcome some of the setbacks that at the moment Keir Starmer appears to be hobbled by. So I don't want a charismatic leader, but I want someone... I think our expectations were whiter than white.
Well,
and it's not too much to ask.
I'm not sure about that phrase, but
I
know what you mean.
It's not too much to ask to say, don't take free clothes off millionaires.
Oh, absolutely, and I think it's not too much to ask for members of a party or non-members of a party, voters, people who vote for you, to lead it and inspire people. I mean, there are inspirational people in Labour, but they don't seem to be at the top, apart from in Manchester.
Well, interesting. Andy Burnham fan in Richmond there. I hear that quite a lot, actually. And well, we shall see. It's early days, but those big hits on Starmer, much more, I think, than the Farmers. I don't know how many people find the sight of David Cameron's sister-in-law, Jeremy Clarkson, and Andrew Lloyd Webber marching through London in protest at their heirs having to pay a putative inheritance tax as moving as the plight of someone like Ben. But I do think that the Suits, Louise mentioned the Suits as well, stalwart Labour supporters really upset by that. And not stupid people, not people who've been manipulated into being upset by the rabid coverage. And the coverage was rabid, make no mistake. But you just try and defend it. Just try and defend it. Even in your own head. Why did you... I didn't break any rules. I declared it. Yeah, but why did you do it? Answer, because there's no one in the building to tell you that it was a really silly thing to do. It's coming up to I just squeeze in Sue because she's in Sheffield. Sue, what would you like to say?
Yeah, as a Labour Party member, this is really hard.
Yeah.
And I presume that gentleman, was he called Ben?
Yes.
I've looked up his age-wise. He's on the new state pension. He will not get it, even though it's under 12k a year. The other thing, in a former life, I worked for DWP. Let's not go there. I hate the only government department I really hated working for. But timing-wise, they have these, how the letters have to go out a certain amount of time before to tell you either whether you're going to get an uplift in your benefit or the benefit's going to be stopped or whatever. So I suspect that's why they did it so quickly after they were in, so that they could get the cycle of letters out to people. I got mine the other day saying I won't get it, but hey-ho. Right. I can manage. I've got a small civil service pension, and believe me, they're not all gold-plated.
No, I know.
$2,000 a year is not gold-plated, but it's better than no. I'm not complaining. And the other thing, that gentleman earlier saying about if they'd have set the bar a little higher, and when state pension's taxable, but they don't tax the state pension, they tax you on any other pensions you get. It's all included within that. So if they'd have given everybody the 200 or 300, set the bar higher, HMRC could have taxed people on it.
Just take it back a different way.
Last. Yeah, they could have done that. And
are we letting the perfect? We're not. Are we letting the perfect be the enemy of the good? I mean, is there ever a policy that everybody rings into this program and says, "Do you know what? I love that."
No, there's never going to be that. And as you said, there's always going to be a cut-off. But $12,000 a year, could they have set it something like 37.5 hours at minimum wage? And universal credit, that's too low as well. But like I say, it's hard being a Labour Party member and defending
these things.
Nobody says the Alan Sugars and the Bransons and all the uber rich people and probably people paying 40% tax,
But people who are barely managing.
Money,
or did Reg call himself a jam? Just about managing. And below that, it's more the people who aren't who are not just about managing, the people in relative poverty.
Yeah.
And you know and I know that I could, and I haven't actually, once during this hour, remind you of yesterday's report showing that 1 in 3 children are already living in poverty. So the sense of there being a finite amount of butter and an awful lot of bread to spread it on gets stronger, but it doesn't stop you feeling that they've got this little bit of the recipe wrong.
Right now, they've and as for the children in place, I think most of us, even members, expected better.
And even if the principle of the policy is correct, the detail of it feels wrong. Thank you, Sue. 11:01 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 5 minutes after 11. I've never noticed this before. It must have happened 100 times. I've never noticed this before. So there's a story I want to talk about, or I want you to talk to me about, in the news today that features claims by a government advisor set to be made later today that schools need to cut down on middle-class references. They should cut down on museum and theatre trips, remove references to middle-class activities like skiing holidays, and instead focus more on the miners' strike, the Jarrow March. People like Michael Faraday, Charles Dickens and Mary Anning, more working-class heroes. And I like this story for a number of reasons that I'll share with you in a moment. But guess what? So the headline is Curriculum Much Too Middle Class, or Cut Middle Class References to Skiing and Theatre, Schools Told. And I was just seeing how it had been reported in other newspapers from the one I have in front of me. And guess what I just found? I can't remember this happening before. Middle-class subjects is another headline. Middle-class subjects alienate deprived pupils. Children should be taught personal skills rather than middle-class traditional subjects that alienate deprived pupils, a government advisor will claim today. That's in 2008. So that was more than 16 years ago. And it's exactly the same story. I don't remember noticing it at the time. And then another one. This is a drop middle-class academic subjects, says school advisor. And that's from 2012. So that's 4 years later and 12 years ago. I presume I could probably, if I had the time, find another story in the intervening dozens of years that would have a advisor to schools saying exactly the same things. I don't know that I've ever thought about this before. I realised some time ago, and I think it was what you could loosely describe as a Michael Gove moment. I found myself wondering why I quite liked Michael Gove. This is going back a long way, don't at me, all right? The curse of O'Brien. Whenever I find warm words to say about a right-wing politician, they almost immediately do something in public that makes a complete mockery of the idea that I ever had even vaguely warm words to say about them. Probably the apotheosis of this condition from which I suffer happened with Matt Hancock, would you believe? I know, Keith's shaking his head. He was here. But the Michael Gove moment I had was realising that he favoured education policies that suited the child he used to be. Just if you're interested in amateur psychology, I think the fact that he, like me, was adopted in similar circumstances also played into this curious sense of fellow feeling that I had. But I can't remember the process by which this was stripped away. It must have been you. You must have explained to me why this system of education was not a good thing for the entire curriculum to be built around, because it would actually not be good for the majority of pupils. So because he was big on sort of examining and measuring and league tabling and all of those things, and I quite liked that mode of education because it suited me, I quite liked some of his policies. And then I realised that I was wrong, and that the system of constant assessment, for example, was a much better means of education than staying up for all night before an exam, mainlining Nescafe granules, smashing the exam, and then forgetting everything that you'd crammed into your tiny bonds by tea time on the day of the exam. So just because it suited me, and I liked the academic elbow sort of shoving, the academic shoulder barging of having league tables and coming top. And what it was, I realised, was the academic equivalent of sports days. It was the academic equivalent of liking sports days because I won all the races. That's not what happened. But if I had won all the races, I'd have loved sports day. And we touched on this yesterday when we were talking about Britain being the lowest in Western Europe on the life expectancy scale. We've got some fascinating and not immediately obvious answers, with PE in schools being one of them, and comparisons with other countries, and the problem of our sports being so achievement driven. I think it's a lot better now, but people used to get very, very cross about the idea of sports day being very inclusive, sports day being for everybody, nobody necessarily winning, but everybody getting rewarded for taking part. And that, of course, is how it should be. If you set the goal of you've got 100 children and you want to make them all fitter, you probably don't do it by giving a medal to one of them every year. Do you see what I mean? You do it by introducing a new way of doing things that actually improves the fitness of all 100 children, even the ones that are picked last for football, or the ones that are chased around the cross-country track by a teacher, kicking them up the backside for going so. I'm sure that's not allowed anymore, but goodness me, in the 1980s, that was commonplace. You see what I mean? So what do you want from your system? Do you want a system that gives a medal to one kid in every 100 every year? Or do you want a system that lifts up all 100 in ways that are not as immediately measurable, but which are self-evident? And I think academics are a bit like that as well. You know, if you're going to examine children, someone has to come top. But do you want a system that gives a gold medal to one kid in every 100 every year? Or do you want a system that increases the education, increases the knowledge, the understanding, the critical thinking skills of all 100 children? And that is why I realised Michael Gove was not the Messiah, but was rather a very naughty boy. That was before I heard the other stuff. The question then today becomes about, for me personally, about the stuff I like being bad. So my initial reaction to this story, schools should cut down on museum and theatre trips. I'm 13 again. I'm 12 again. I'm going to the Rose Theatre in Kidderminster on a school trip. We all get on the minibus. I can smell the petrol. Why did that van smell so bad? Anyway, I could smell the petrol on the little wooden benches in the back of the school minibus as we drove to the Rose Theatre in Kidderminster, and we all went in to watch, I don't know, a Terence Rattigan play or a Richard Brinsley Sheridan drama, and it was wonderful, and I loved it, and I got my love of live theatre in that moment, and Mum and Dad would take me to the theatre. We'd go to the pantomime. I saw Les Dawson once at the Hippodrome in Birmingham, and then as I got older, we'd go to Stratford-upon-Avon to watch Shakespeare. I saw Kenneth Branagh in Henry V, Roger Allam in Nicholas Nickleby. I can wax lyrical for weeks about the impact that live theatre has had on me. But some people listening, I might as well be speaking Mandarin. But does that make it bad? Does that mean that schools shouldn't be doing it? Because it alienates children from backgrounds different from mine. And I don't know what the relationship is between class and education. I don't know what it is. I don't think the theatre should be seen as middle class. Some people would be furious at the idea that it's seen as middle class. Julie Hesmanhout, who was in that Post Office drama, she's a brilliant guest on Full Disclosure. You might know her as Hayley from Coronation Street, but she's done loads since. Julie was one of those actors who worked really closely with the community, saw theatre as a working class weapon with which to teach politics, to teach equality, to teach decency, and that kind of agitprop theatre is hugely important. But is it enough to justify theatrical references and museum trips in schools? I mean, I balk at the idea that they're middle class activities, but I am very, very middle class, and I love them. I love them. Jonathan manages somehow to turn this valid criticism and reflection of what I'm saying, he manages to turn it into a rather nice compliment. Everyone should be more Jonathan. I love the way you killed it, he writes, on Celebrity Mastermind, but that's you and not most people. That's what I'm trying to convey. It suited me, that, right? It suited me. I could cram all my J.D. Salinger knowledge into my head, and I were pretty good at general knowledge, largely because of my memory and my education and my life. But the idea that if you had 100 people and you wanted them all, you had 100 people for a week, and at the end of that week you wanted them all to know more than they did at the beginning, would preparing for celebrity mastermind really be the best way to do it? Or even for civilian mastermind, or whatever you prefer to call it. Would preparing for mastermind be the best way to improve the education of the 100 adults that you've got for a week? No, it wouldn't, because it really suited my mind. It really suits my brain. But the system shouldn't just reflect the people who benefit from the system. I don't know. And I don't know who can answer this. Can you answer this? Did you find it unhelpful? So we've got museum and theatre trips, references to middle-class activities like skiing holidays. I don't quite get that. I mean, does that just mean if you've got a maths question and it says 17 children are going on a ski trip at £249 each, how many children? I don't know. I've never been. I tell a lie. I went on a skiing trip when I was 10. That's pretty middle class, right? I've never been since. Didn't take to it. I'll probably get thrown out of a middle class WhatsApp group for admitting that. I haven't been skiing since 1989. No, 1982. Just explain it to me. There's another article saying scrap Shakespeare and study Instagram posts instead. But are the elements of the arts middle class? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. I balk at this because I think that good theatre is universal. I think that good books are universal. I think that reading about, we read about emperors, we read about rulers and kings, and we benefit from it. So I don't really know what the criticism is from Lee Elliott Major, a professor of social mobility at Exeter University. But I don't want to poo-poo it. I don't want to dismiss it. I went to the Museum of Working People in Manchester, or the Museum of the Working Class? One of the best days out. That's what this is about, isn't it? So I can go to the British Museum and look at an old pharaoh, or I can go to the Museum of the Working People in Manchester and learn about things like the Chartists, or Ellen Wilkinson, or the Jarrow Marchers, or the Peterloo Massacre. Things that are really relevant to the lived experience of ordinary people in Britain today. Or I can go on a school trip to the National Portrait Gallery and look at pictures of Henry VIII. That's not fair. The National Portrait Gallery is brilliant. But my point about pharaohs is strong. Or I can go and visit the Tower of London and learn about Anne Boleyn being shipped to Traitor's Gate. What's that got to do with me? Peterloo Massacre. People were protesting about poverty and got cut down by the king's horses and the king's men, never to get up again. That's relevant. Is that what this is about? 0345 6060 973. What would a more working class curriculum look like? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And I'm not going to stop saying that, Philip, just because you keep trying to get through and failing. When I say it out loud, it's true. Admittedly, by the time you actually get around to pressing the numbers, it may no longer be true. But it is true now. There are 6 phone lines free into the studio as I speak. What would a more working class curriculum look like? 0345 6060 973. Genuine question. Important question. So glad I remembered that little museum in Manchester at the end of this. One of the coolest places in town. Coolest places in the country. But the bit I can't do is describe what it feels like to be alienated by a middle-class curriculum. So you grew up, you went to school, you know what this is about. You inherently know what this is about. You did find references to jam making, rocking horses and house purchases in exam questions. Ridiculous, because you had no personal relationship with, and these are the examples given by the advisors, jam making, rocking horses and house purchases. So what would a working class curriculum look like? 0345 6060 973. And give me examples of a middle class curriculum alienating students, alienating pupils. I really, really want your answers to this. So if you're toying with the idea of ringing in, but you don't normally bother, but you think you've got something I think this could be fascinating. But it is, as ever, entirely up to you.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 20 minutes after 11, you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It comes around almost as often as Christmas. Calls by government advisors to make the curriculum, the school's curriculum, less middle class. We're trying to work out, A, what that means, B, what the alternative would look like, and C, how it feels or what it looks like to be alienated as a student, as a young person, as a pupil, by precisely the sort of references and pastimes that I, as an epitome of the middle class, I always rather liked. George is in Lewisham. George, what do you think?
Hi,
Hello.
think... How are you?
Very well.
Very good. As much as I sound like I'm from Harrow, I'm not. I went to a state school in Bristol. I think the notion that it is a middle-class thing is quite diminutive and quite diminishing of just people. Everyone can enjoy the arts. But I think it is a direct causality of the way this class system is baked into the UK, because it is so expensive to do and engage in the arts.
Well, that's a reason to do more theatre trips. That's a way that they make them accessible to schools. I made a right plum of myself once with, I think it was Nicholas Heitner, and I stood up at some dinner and made precisely the points that you've just made when he was running the National Theatre, and he explained in some detail the schemes they had in place to get children from state schools into the audiences at the National Theatre. But you, that to me feels intrinsically like a force for good. Yeah,
and the National is great. The National, and especially as an under-25, the National offers £10 tickets to most of their shows.
English National Opera, you can go for free if you're under 18, which is an extraordinary scheme. I 100% recommend it. So what do we think this is about then? Because the arts is a very broad church, and what this advisor is saying is you teach people like Dickens more perhaps than you would teach Jane Austen. So you teach you're not eschewing the arts, you're not doing away with the arts, you're just trying to focus more upon things that might be relevant to a majority rather than a minority.
There's a couple of points on this, I think. There's a mix of, I went to school from 2011 to 2017 so I was prime Michael Gove Education Secretary when he brutally just destroy the education system. I don't know if that's a surprise. I'm probably not a Tory voter. Sure. I don't know if you can tell. He did a couple of things. During the tenure, they reduced arts funding. My school went from being a performing arts specialist school and got extra funding for being so. But in 2011, they decided that performing arts wasn't a specialist subject anymore, and only started funding STEM schools. We're
going a little bit off the track here, but because the idea of relevance. So even science teachers are saying that they want they want the curriculum changed as well. Maybe using class is misleading, albeit that's what the story is about. That's what the headlines say. And talking more about relevance, working class culture, classroom discussions dominated by middle class ways of speaking and behaving. So you might have been to a state school in Bristol, but immediately you came on the programme, you essentially established that you have a middle class way of speaking and behaving by suggesting that you sounded like you'd gone to Harrow. And that's fine, but that perhaps is helpful in pinning down better what this story is actually about. Classroom discussions dominated by middle-class ways of speaking and behaving. We wouldn't feel alienated by that. The highest status won by children who excel in narrow academic performance. But as I said at the outset, this story comes around every 4 or 5 years, and it never happens. And possibly that's because no one can quite pin down what it is that they want to happen. Study more of what? Thank you, George. Linda's in Beamish in County Durham. Linda, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello.
I was just listening.
You sound surprised to find yourself on the radio, Linda.
I know, it's quite bizarre.
Well, you're very welcome.
I teach creative or just creative approaches for a digital media department in a massive college in Middlesbrough.
Right.
I admit I am middle class. I have truffle dust.
Yes. You have truffle dust?
Yeah.
What's truffle dust?
Oh, you sprinkle it on stuff like...
Oh, I know. You mean literally truffle dust?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where I'm coming from. But
I'm going to go, Jane. No, I hate that. I mean, it's very expensive, I presume.
Yeah, but you don't need much.
No, but it shouldn't be middle because it's food. Jamie Oliver tells a story about some lads from his school who were in the traveller community, and they came back to the family pub, and he gave them smoked salmon on buttered fresh bread. And he said it was a seminal moment in his life because their faces just were alive with deliciousness. And so the idea that delicious food is middle class is, I think you're right, that's how we see it. But I like to fight against that idea because, in France, they'd laugh us out of the brasserie if we thought that good food was confined to a certain social class. But I know what you mean.
A lot of the deliciousness comes from sort of working class origins,
quite
like
often.
oysters and.
Quite often. Anyway, back to the creativity. Sorry, I was getting distracted by you.
So it's my job to help sort of post-COVID teens, because it's a college of FE.
Yes.
It's a brilliant college. But the teenagers I work with, I'm trying to prompt them continually to be creative for things like media, games design, movie scripts.
And what role does class play in that?
Right, the role that class plays in that is that, for example, we try and organise trips.
Yeah.
And even if you say, look, we've got a great deal, it's only going to be 25 quid, including your bus and your pay-in, and you'll need to provide your own lunch. And most of the students say, I'm sorry, we can't manage that.
Yeah.
Even things like, I'll say, right, your homework this week is to go to the pictures and watch this movie we've just discussed.
Can't do it.
Not possible.
Miss. Can't do it, miss. But these are arguments, it'd be harder for cinemas, these are arguments in a way for theatres to open up empty seats for free to school children, aren't they? They're not arguments to stop sending school children to the theatre.
But then the obstacle you get is that if you say, right, we're going to go and see this play that is Charles Dickens' interpretation or Shakespeare or something, there's no interest at all. I mean, I tried to show mine because Jaws, I think, turned 50 this year.
Right.
So I showed them the cinema trailer from the 70s. And when I looked up from the screen, no one was paying attention. They weren't interested.
It's different. So different. I mean, that's attention levels, isn't it? And the distraction and things like that. There's a museum near you, isn't there? The Beamish Living Museum of Northern Life.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
And the good thing about it is that, it's expensive to get in the first time, but your ticket lasts a year.
Oh, that is good. That is good. Chris has been. I think you must have jogged his memory when I said where you were ringing from. I'm getting other recommendations as well. Laura tells me about the Pencil Museum in Keswick, which she visited on her honeymoon. There's a joke there somewhere, but I'm not the man to make it. And Sue tells me, you'll never guess what's in the Lawnmower Museum in Southport. Well, you might, actually, lawnmowers. There's a carpet museum in Kidderminster, but these are not relevant to the conversation that we're having. Linda's point is, and so will Wayne in Leeds's be. Wayne, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. Yes, I mean, I went to a working class school. It was very working class, and it was pretty rough.
Right.
And it wasn't, we obviously learned about Shakespeare, but that was the only way it was accessible to us. So we never had any school trips. We didn't really get the opportunity to go to theatre. And it kind of then sort of created this inverted snobbery for us, where you sort of think, well, that isn't for us, that's kind of for them. And I think, if anything, it then limits your opportunities, because you start thinking, well, how can I actually get there? If you see what I mean. And then I think by sort of reinforcing this working class curriculum, I think
for me, but not for thee sort of messaging.
Exactly,
right.
Completely, and that's kind of how it comes across anyway. I mean, in terms of that, but I think I've been very fortunate in that I managed to sort of get to uni and obviously get a career. And I think now I go to the theatre regularly. Sorry, and I just wish that opportunity would have been there.
This is an argument for doing it better, not for doing away with it. So this advisor suggests schools should stop visiting theatres and museums and go instead to visit local football clubs and grounds for tours exploring how they have served local communities for generations. They could collaborate with artists and musicians to explore grime and rap music, or brass bands and community choirs, attend graffiti art workshops reflecting local culture, or invite tradespeople into the school to speak or to run workshops.
I mean, I think it definitely needs to be more inclusive, and I think obviously using some of those examples would be great, but at the same time, I don't think that necessarily means that you have to do away with opportunities, because you're going to have some kids that for all they know, they could be like the theatre stars of the future, but if they're not going to see it, and there's that reinforcement of, well, it's not for you, then what else are they going to do?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be either or. But I tell you one thing for nothing. 10 years ago, I'd have been spitting nails about this story. I'd have been right up on my middle class high horse, talking about how ridiculous it would be to go to a football club instead of the theatre. But I mean, you can see the point. Football clubs played extraordinary roles in community development. Where I used to live, on the Queen's Park estate, it's called, in West London, the role, as you might imagine, Queen's Park Rangers grew from that estate, and the story of how it grew from a community enterprise is absolutely fascinating, and most people living there probably weren't aware of it. That would be more interesting than a visit to a museum to look at artefacts from ancient Egypt. Or would it? Yes, I think it would. It's 11:31. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:34. Actually, the more you read into it, the more interesting it becomes. That's not always the case with these kind of stories. Listen to this. See if you agree with this. In fact, just imagine in your head a little needle. And tell me where it points to on levels of interest. Start at 0, go up to 10. Just as importantly, this advisor said, it's about recognising the hidden talents developed by children exposed to challenging environments such as poverty or chronic stress. So every year, pupils who have enjoyed the stage or slopes and come from owned homes are much more likely to be able to answer questions that involve things like ski trips or classical concerts, jam making or house purchases than those who haven't. Okay, this is the bit I want you to think about in terms of how interesting you find this. Instead of celebrating the obvious stuff like children getting into Oxbridge or children getting into university, schools should also celebrate leavers who become plumbers or nurses. That stopped me, because this is so of a piece with my upbringing, my education, that you almost feel bruised when it comes under attack. But of course, schools should applaud the success of people outside of the areas that are currently applauded. That's such an obvious point, and yet it had never occurred to me before in my life. As well as celebrating pupils getting into Oxbridge, Major said schools should also make a fuss about leavers who become plumbers or nurses. It's about levelling the playing field by having content that more pupils can relate to. So if you're teaching Dickens, teach the bit about his dad going to jail for debt, which meant that Dickens himself spent time in a workhouse, which is a crucial part of understanding his politics, never mind much of his literature. Michael Faraday, the physicist, grew up in abject poverty. Father was a blacksmith. He developed his love of science after being apprenticed to a bookseller. These stories make people feel that anything is possible, whereas this is what is meant by a middle-class curriculum, and this I felt that the lad in Leeds explained this perfectly. The first lad in Leeds, Wayne in Leeds, explained this perfectly, that it actually do it wrong and it feels exclusionary. Do it right and it feels inclusive. Mike's in Peterlee, appropriately enough. That has a proud place in British political history. Mike, what would you like to say?
First of all, I've moved to Peterlee. I'm not from here, so right. Don't ask me anything about the history of Peterlee.
I won't.
Right. So, anyhow, I grew up in a deprived town, deprived school, and basically left at 15. Culture isn't the same as class. Is the main part. I mean, I like the theatre. I love music. I can listen to, classical music, quite like that. I'll go around galleries, I'll go around museums. And at school, we were trained to basically believe that we were going to be drones in the shipyard.
Yes.
And it's like you always say, you can't be what you can't see.
I do always say that.
and the class system does really depend on, you're the drones, you do the work, we'll do all the clever, well-paid stuff.
You felt that? I mean, you feel that looking back? You weren't conscious of it at the time, or were you?
No, because we didn't have any aspiration. We weren't expected to do anything. We were expected to work in the shipyard or one of the local factories. You know, there was only 2 kids I knew at school that went on to higher education.
But aren't you falling into the trap that we've just described? I don't want to sound all kind of holier than thou, but what's wrong with going to work in the local factory? Why shouldn't the school be... I see, because you're being told that's all you were good for, in a sense.
Yes, that's it. It wasn't... There's no shame. I worked in a couple of factories, right? But there's no shame in working in a factory. And back in the 80s, you'd get a good wage for doing that.
Yes.
You know, but it's the fact that that's what you're going to do. Your life's planned out. Your dad works in the factory. You're going to work in the factory. Your kids will work in the factory. You are never going to get out of this town and do anything with your life. And that's great, because we need nuclear submarines. We don't want people like you in banking. And we don't want you ever questioning why the Queen's making so much money. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I think that's part of it. So the idea of cultural capital, it does prioritise middle-class pursuits like museums, theatres, highbrow art galleries, but it doesn't need to be either or. You just also need to celebrate stuff that's more democratic and more inclusive.
Yeah. I mean, when you read out that last bit about, you know, maybe we should also chuck in more practical working class skills, as well as, rather than get rid of any culture, because it's not class, it's culture.
There's a link, though. I think Martin Amis wrote something about how fiction, the stuff that entertains us, whether on the stage or on the page, it began with gods, stories about gods. If you think of the ancients, you think of the classical civilizations, and then it became stories about rulers, emperors and kings, and then it became stories about aristocrats. You'd sort of think the 19th century and Jane Austen, and stories about the upper middle, upper class, and then a bit of a democratization begins to kick in with Dickens, and by the time you get to the 1960s and 1970s, we're watching dramas about factories. We're watching Saturday Night, Sunday Morning with Albert Finney. We're reading Alan Sillitoe books. So that's a fascinating way of showing that there are relationships between culture and class. And what happened in the 60s with the kitchen sink dramas was that finally drama was about the working class experience in ways that it hardly ever had been before. So this academic would argue kids should be taught more, studying more, the lives of people whose lives are a bit like theirs.
I think it's changed in recent years, very recent years. But when you see the working class depicted on television, you're looking at Shameless and
you are now.
EastEnders.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You're not seeing any aspiration in those dramas, are you? You know, it's like, this is your life. This is where you stay. Oh, and by the way, isn't it funny that you're faking disability to get the doll?
Yeah.
Ha ha ha. That's really funny. And it's written by people in London, you know.
Well, often, I don't know that Shameless is, but
Shameless isn't.
No, but I take your point. I mean, this has been, I think it was someone told me that EastEnders, a couple of posh lads went in as writers on EastEnders. Who was telling me about this? And they had to rewrite the lines in their own head on set because it was so utterly unrealistic. That's relevant to what we're talking about, but I can't quite pin down precisely why. It's that idea of you can't be what you can't see. And the alienation is something I'm never going to get my head around, because I was precisely the sort of pupil that the system is geared to favour. And it's the favouring of pupils like what I used to be that this professor of social mobility at Exeter University has got on his sights. Mike, thank you. I've done the history lesson for Peter Lee. I was wrong anyway. I don't know why I had it in my head that Peter Lee was a major part of the Jarrow March, but I don't think it was, actually. So there you go. I hope my parents can get a refund on my school fees. Sue's in Portsmouth. Sue, what would you like to say?
Down here in Portsmouth,
Hello,
we
Sue.
have a local street artist called My Dog Size, and he puts
Called what?
exercises. Size, his name is.
There's a phone line went a bit far. What? Say that once more. Sorry. It is a clicky phone line. I can't. I'll come back to you, Sue. Sorry. Angus is. I think I was getting on Sue's nerves a bit then. Angus is in Putney. Angus, what would you like to say?
Hey, James. I have never called into the radio before, so this is the first.
Well, how old are you?
I'm 23.
Oh, come on. It's just not that surprising. Most 23-year-olds, everyone has to start somewhere, Angus. Go on. What made you pick up the phone?
I'm 23. I've been raised in a middle-class family.
Yes.
I'm very aware of middle class now. I wasn't when I was growing up, obviously. That's kind of how it works. I've been pursuing a career in film, in commercials, and I'm lucky to be sort of freelancing and doing that. And I'm going to do a master's in filmmaking, and the course fees are astronomical, and I'm amazed at how anybody from a working class family would be able to break into this, because it's like, this is only an opportunity I've been afforded by being in a middle class family, having parents that are able to cover it.
I think that's worse than it ever was, actually. I think that some of the doors that have shut in the last 20 years are arguably more than there were when I was your age.
Yeah, it's crazy. And even being able to pursue a freelance career has been because I've had that ability to go, oh, well, if it all goes wrong, my parents own their house and there's a lovely place I can go back to, and it can, And even when I look back at school, and this is what prompted me to call in, was, we studied Shakespeare in school in English, and we brushed over it in a very sort of blasé way. And the only way I ever understood it was when my parents took me to see it, because my school wouldn't take us to go see it. They were insistent that we just studied it as a book, but it's a play, and
which doesn't bring it to life. I don't know. There's a thing here that we're not quite nailing, any of us. There's a sense that there's like a universal truth at the heart of what this academic is saying. Some of us balk at it because it describes us in ways that are a little bit unflattering, or it posits the creation of a new order in which we wouldn't be naturally privileged and naturally advantaged. I mean, people like you and me. And then other people, other callers, describing things that were denied to them that should have not have been denied to them, which is coming at the same point from the opposite angle. But then, the idea of going to a football ground to learn about the community as opposed to going to a museum makes a sort of sense, doesn't it? It makes a sort of, I don't know what the word is. There's a lot. I mean, it would be more relevant to more people. And therefore a better mode of education. But you're right. I mean, teaching kids stuff that is going to give them expectations they can't possibly hope to fulfill unless they've got relatively wealthy parents feels cruel almost, as opposed to inclusive or helpful. Thank you, Angus. It's 11:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The artist in Bristol is called My Dog Sighs, as in a dog sighing. My dog sighs. But I hope it wasn't just me that had that click. I hope it wasn't my headphones. I hope it was the phone line. Otherwise, poor old Sue would be right to be aggrieved. PMQs today, isn't it? Yeah, PMQs. Guess who's doing PMQs? You see, you'll never guess. Angela Rayner's doing it. Guess who else? The Conservatives haven't got a deputy leader. If you know the answer to that, off the top of your head, mind, all right? None of that Googling. If you know the answer to who is going to be opposite Angela Rayner at PMQs today, then I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you the money myself.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:48 is the time. Absolutely nobody knows. I mean, that's not true. I just mean no one has got the correct answer yet. Martin in Kidderminster. Give my regards to the horse fair, Martin, will you? He goes for Mel Stride. Priti Patel gets a few votes. Is it Rishi Sunak, says Warren. Please let it be Mark Francois, says a texter after my own heart. I think we could start a petition. I'll tell you why in a minute. No one has got it right. Jeremy, everyone thinks it's Mel Stride. Oh, someone got it right. Okay, Anthony, I don't know whether you looked it up or not. So Alex Burghardt, who is not a politician as far as I'm aware, who's previously troubled the scorers, will be doing PMQs. But are you 100% sure about that, about doing it on a rota? They're going to... Apparently, what Kemi Badenoch is going to do is let them take turns. So she'll have like a selection of front benchers, and there'll be... I know you can't have a go, Keith. I mean, obviously from front bench Conservative shadows, they're going to have a go. I might start a petition for Mark Francois to do it. If I did that, would you sign it? You know I won't do it. I'm too lazy. But if I wasn't lazy and I did start a petition, or I could persuade one of my colleagues to start a petition to get Mark Francois to do PMQs, you'd almost want a seat in the public gallery for that, wouldn't you? In fact, well, I'll tell you what, stop sending me wrong answers to the question of who it's going to be against. Angela Rayner today. Yeah, Alex Who is the correct answer, actually. Well done. Who would be the funniest? Out of all the people still in Parliament, all the Tories still in Parliament, remember a lot got slung out at the last election, who would be the funniest to go up against Angela Rayner? Be the one you'd... Because if you don't come up with a better suggestion, I am going to start a petition for Marc Francois to do PMQs. Now remember, if we get it up to 100,000, they have to discuss it in the House of Commons. I don't think that bit's true, but it would be funny if they... Marc Francois... I think they'd have to get him a little box to stand on, wouldn't they? So that you could see over the top of the dispatch box. I once did a TV show with Anne Widdecombe, and they gave her a little box for her feet so that they didn't dangle like Humpty Dumpty when she was sitting on a sofa. And she said, "This better not be in shot." She said, "I'll go very cross if this box appears." And I'm sitting next to her on a sofa on, I think it was Channel 5 News, and Anne Widdecombe sitting there with her feet on a little box, and the camera pulled away at the end. And we thought we were out of shot, so I'm sort of getting up, sort of bending down to get up. Do you know what I mean? Like, and it looked like in that moment, it looked like I was shining her shoes. It looked like she was sitting on a sofa with her shoes, with her feet on a little box, and I was there polishing Anne Widdecombe's. What a career! What a career I've led. But if I were going to start a petition for the funniest possible person to go up against Angela Rayner at PMQs, who would that person be? I'm going with Marc Francois at the moment, okay? David's in Cardiff. Back to middle-class curricula. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, so I grew up in a working-class family, for want of a better word. Yes. My father was a factory worker, my mother worked in school dinners, and I was lucky enough to learn the French horn in a fairly average state school.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I went through then, I worked hard, I got that opportunity, and I went to the Royal College of Music in London, became a professional musician, and I've come round full circle, and I now teach instrumental music in the South Wales valleys, bringing what I learned as a child back to grassroots to give other people the same opportunity.
Wow.
It's perceived as elitist.
Yeah.
Classical music, opera, high arts, but it's not. I mean, how much is it to go and see Welsh National Opera? You can pick a ticket up for as little as £15 to £20. How much is it to go and see Taylor Swift perform?
120 quid.
And some.
Yeah, and then you've got to buy a T-shirt and some bracelets.
Yeah. You can access the arts very, very easily. A lot of art galleries are free at entry. I don't know where this idea that it's elitist and it's expensive. I guess you look at the highbrow Royal Opera House, and yes, you can pay £150, £200 a ticket there, but you can also get very reasonably priced tickets as well.
It's chicken and egg, isn't it? I'm really oscillating on this one. I'm going from thinking, God, this fella's got a point, to thinking, hang on a minute, what's he on about? With almost every minute of this hour, because an awful lot of what we're hearing are reasons to do more trips, not fewer.
No, and exactly. And do you know what, James? I would say that I'm not taking it away from the sports, because I think music in education, art in education, dance and sports, they all provide children with the same fundamental grounding, teamwork. They provide...
Yes, that's very true, yes.
And this is a real big bugbear of mine. Consecutive governments, in my opinion, have put so much emphasis on English and maths over the recent years. Rightly so. It's pushed arts and humanities and to some degree sports to the side. Now, what we're doing in education at the moment, for me, is we're trying to fit every single shape into the same box, and they don't all fit.
Yeah.
And it's going to do one of two things, sadly. It's either going to break the box or it's going to break the things we're putting in the box.
And this is what I was talking about with Michael Gove, is that because the box fitted me perfectly, I made the mistake of thinking it was a good idea for everybody, and that was really, really, really silly. So, and I mention again that the English National Opera has even more generous schemes in place, particularly for under 18s or under 21s, who can actually go for free. So, because we must be missing something then as well, because the idea that some of these things are exclusionary is true, isn't it? Because, schools, that's what I mean by chicken and egg. Do you become someone who thinks the theatre isn't for you and therefore we should do more theatre, or are people rightly feeling that theatre isn't for them, therefore we should be doing something other than theatre? I got there in the end. Finally.
I think people can't tell you that until they're exposed to that.
No, I think you're right. So we need more exposure
to it.
Yes.
And the same with football. When I was in school, we were taken to the theatre. We were also taken to football matches and rugby matches, sports trips, music trips.
So we want more, not less. And I guess one problem with suggesting, you're a teacher, you know more about this than I do, that it's not either or, is that the curriculum's already pretty crammed as it is, as you say, heavily favouring maths and English. So doing more on top of what's already being done is probably a little bit pie in the sky. Thank you, David. The French horn's a beautiful instrument. Did you get one? Did the school provide you with a French horn when you were a kid?
The county had free lessons in school, so we didn't have to pay for lessons, and they had county instruments of which you could provide. The county I work for at the moment, we still provide the instruments for free, and it's varying costs of lessons per school, but it's not the full price. It's all subsidised still by the county, which is fantastic. But I also taught for the National Children's Orchestra of Great Britain. I tutored the French horns for them, so I've done both ends of the spectrum. Yeah. And my fear is that those with money, those with privilege, will be the only people to get these opportunities in the future.
Yeah, now we're back to the chicken and egg then, aren't we? Because the people aren't getting it, therefore why are we still casting it as something to aspire to when they're never going to get it? Or the people aren't getting it, so make sure they do. There are two responses to it. Maybe the correct answer is somewhere in between the two. It is 11:57, PMQs on the way. Natasha joining me shortly to pontificate upon what might be coming up there. But before that, Harley is in Wigan. Harley, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, I'd say what made me pick up is the fact I was lucky enough to grow up middle class, but I grew up in a working class area.
Right.
So I could see very much the divide that having these opportunities causes. And I'd say it's a case of we need more trips. I did a degree in history, and the reason I got into history is not because of the lessons of what we usually taught. It's going to these museums with my family on the weekends and seeing these different parts of history that intrigued me.
This is. I can't remember the last time this happened. I am absolutely torn on this because You describe what worked for you, and therefore we think that would be beneficial to everybody, and I agree with you, but we are describing a system that prioritises and rewards people who do what you do. That puts that idea of celebrating people who get into university when we're not celebrating in schools people who leave to become plumbers and nurses. I don't know whether it's reductivist or whether it's actually an evolution of the education system to recognise that for most people, museums and theatre are not part of their daily life. But the education system prioritises and prizes them, which excludes people who don't have a background like yours or mine.
No,
it's really tricky, this.
No, I completely agree. I've been flip-flopping on which way I thought coming on, but I thought it'd be worth noting that I'd say, even though we should be celebrating those who do trades, because
absolutely we should, and bring them into schools as well, and doing all of that. But is it back to either or? Chicken and egg and either or, the phrases this hour. Harley, thank you. It is 11:59. Natasha Clark is here. PMQs is on the way. Who will be doing it for the Tories?
Have you heard of Alex Burkhardt?
Is that a song? Not? Is that a song? You hum it or play it?
Alex Burkhardt is going to be standing in for Kemi Badenoch today. Keir Starmer's flying back from Rio de Janeiro, so he's not in action.
Tell me 5 things about Alex Burkhardt.
He was a teacher. He used to work for Theresa May as an assistant. 2. He started preparing Kemi Badenoch for Prime Minister's questions. He was
3.
previously the skills minister. He's got quite poofy hair.
Quite what?
Poofy hair.
Poofy hair?
Like it's sort of,
Bouffon.
It's quite like fluffy stuff, what it used to be last time. Yeah, big hair. Exactly. Is that okay? Is that enough? Yes. He's got glasses.
I think you played a blinder there. That's just all 5 things, and we'll check the hair shortly. And indeed, as soon as he gets to his feet, we will cross live to the House of Commons. So
I actually had to tell the Tories that they had to find someone to come up with a deputy leader earlier this weekend. And I said, Keir Starmer is going to be out of the country for Prime Minister's questions. Who is Kemi Badenoch's deputy? And they went, that's a great question. Are you sure Keir Starmer's going to be out of the country?
Which Tories were you talking to?
Sorry, I know it shouldn't be allowed. Really,
no, I don't mind. But I mean, senior enough for you to think they really didn't have a plan.
Well, they didn't. Kemi Badenoch has not appointed a deputy Tory party leader. So there isn't anyone that naturally is going to stand in. However, we are reading reports in the papers today that she's going to let all of them have a go.
That's what Eleanor told me.
Yeah.
I mean, not literally all of them.
Well, I mean, there isn't
Would you sign my petition to get Mark Francois up at PMQs, or would you consider that unprofessional?
He's a shadow minister again now?
You have to be a minister? Yeah, you must.
You have to be a shadow secretary of state.
He is a shadow. Oh,
I think he's a junior minister, so I think possibly not. I disagree with this. I think you should at least be having someone that the public might have heard of.
Well, they've not started well then, have they?
Exactly. No, I disagree with this. But they've not got a lot to choose.
What do you think he'll go in on?
Well, farmers is obviously the most obvious one with what we saw happen yesterday. But, in a week where the Prime Minister has also met the Chinese President Xi, and also a week where Putin's doing a lot of sabre rattling, there's quite a lot of right ground to go with.
Did you see what happened to the journalists when Keir Starmer started asking about Jimmy Lai and other...
Yeah, that was the moment when he talked about Jimmy Lai, when he talked about his health deteriorating. That was the moment they started bundling the journalists. And that just goes to show for Keir Starmer the real problem he's going to have. If he wants to get closer to the Chinese, then he's going to have a problem on his hands.
Oddly, Jimmy's son Sebastien will be joining me at 12:45 today to discuss developments in his father's case, along with his father's lawyer. It was an extraordinary moment, if you didn't see it, when the journalists were essentially, as soon as Starmer started raising subjects with which Xi Jinping was uncomfortable, the journalists were summarily removed from the building. The hands placed over camera lenses, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, kudos to him for mentioning it in front of the whole cameras, in front of President Xi in the first place. So, it's taking a step forward, even if you disagree with Keir Starmer having these conversations with the Chinese president. At least he's sort of doing it on camera and seemingly unafraid. And I did think at the time, I thought this looks like a little bit of an afterthought to say it right at the end of lavishing praise on the Chinese delegation. He really went in and sort of rolled out the red carpet saying, look, can't wait to come visit you. We'd love to have you. Rachel Reeves would love to come over and see you. But at the end being like, we will still raise things like human rights abuses and Jimmy Lai.
So what do we think apart from farmers?
I'm wondering if inflation might be something to come up, because obviously that's shot up, and the Tories like to think they are the guardians, the bastions of a safe and stable economy. I think some people will disagree, but they like to think so, don't they? So I wonder if they'll say, actually, you know what, Labour promised to do things to reduce the cost of living, but actually now it could be creeping up again.
And without being rude, I'm not sure I would have chosen the person who was coaching Kemi Badenoch for doing PMQs. I'm not sure that would have been my first choice at this stage in proceeding.
Yeah, no, it would be interesting to see.
But she might be a very bad student. She might be a brilliant teacher.
Maybe he is the secret weapon, but she's just not listening to him. So maybe this is his own chance to say, look, Kemi, this is how you should do it at Prime Minister's Questions. But yes, he's a little bit more of an experienced politician than she is. He's been a minister for quite a lot longer. So
and here he is.
He might give it a go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very happy to associate myself and this side of the House with the remarks the Right Honourable Lady made about Ukraine. Democracies must stand together. What is the government doing to bring down inflation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's astonishing that, and first of all, can I welcome the Right Honourable Member to his place? And many people might not know, Mr. Speaker, but the Honourable Member was the Minister for Growth when, under Liz Truss, inflation was 11.1% and growth flatlines. So we're doing much better than he did.
Well, the truth is that I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady for her standard charm. The truth is, this government isn't doing anything to bring down inflation. This government is stoking inflation. First, we had above-inflation pay rises for the unions. Then, we had a budget which the OBR said would increase inflation.
Order. Sorry. Right, I'm going to hear the question. I suggest we all hear it together, then our constituents can understand the answer as well as the question. Alex Burke.
Very kind, Mr. Speaker. First, we had above-inflation pay rises for the unions. Then, we had a budget which the OBR said was going to push up inflation. This morning, we had city economists, real economists, Mr. Speaker, saying that next year inflation would hit 3%. Does the Right Honourable Lady agree that this government's decisions mean higher inflation for working people?
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Honourable Gentleman, 11.1% or 3%?
We've already talked about Ukraine, Mr. Speaker. It was Ukraine and COVID that drove up inflation. This government is doing it to the British people. High tax, high inflation, low growth, low reform. There's a word for that, Mr. Speaker. It's Starmerism. Yesterday, like many honourable members on this side of the House, I spoke to farmers from across the United Kingdom. Some of them families who farmed their land for centuries, elderly men in tears, children worried about their parents, all of them worried that their way of life is about to be destroyed. What would the Right Honourable Lady like to say to them?
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely committed to our British farmers, and that's why we've committed £5 billion to the farming budget over the next 2 years. That's the largest ever amount for sustainable food production in the UK. And it's alongside £60 million, Mr. Speaker, to support those affected by extreme wet weather, and over £200 million to tackle disease outbreaks. His party couldn't even get the money out the door for farmers, failing to spend over £300 million on farming budgets. The farmers know they ruined it for them, and that's why we're in government and they're not.
Well, perhaps the Right Honourable Lady thinks that everyone came to London yesterday to thank the government. Let's look at the facts. A typical mid-sized 360-acre family farm in the constituency of my Right Honourable friend for Thirsk and Moulton. They've spoken to their accountant. Their new liability because of this government is £500,000. That's 12 years' worth of profit. When this generation passes away, that farm will become totally unviable, and it's just one of thousands and thousands of similar farms. It's clear the government hasn't got its facts right. The Central Association for Agricultural Valuers, the real experts in this field, say so. The NFU says so. They're shortly to publish a report showing that 75% of all commercial farms will fall above the threshold. If the government isn't going to reverse this terrible policy, will the Right Honourable Lady at least commit that there will be no further increases to inheritance tax and no further reductions to agricultural property relief or business property relief in this Parliament?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about the facts, and I absolutely stand by the figures the government has set out. And the vast majority of estate owners will be totally unaffected. He wants to talk about the figures, Mr. Speaker. I will be crystal clear. The vast majority of estate owners will see no change and pay no tax on land passed on valued at £1 million. Couples can pass on £3 million, Mr. Speaker, tax-free, and those above the thresholds will pay only half the normal rate and can pay over 10 years interest-free.
This is just another part of the budget that's unravelling, Mr. Speaker. Everyone here and all the farmers at home will have heard there was no guarantee there. We know what that means. They're coming back for more. And even if the Honourable Lady had made a promise today, it wouldn't have been worth a fig. We know that the Environment Secretary, before the election, promised the farmers this wouldn't happen. Labour promises get broken. Let's put all of this into context. The Treasury says the family farms tax will raise on average £441 million a year. The Treasury also says that the public sector pay rises the government announced in July will cost £9.4 billion a year. That's over 21 times as much. Why does the government think that above inflation pay rises for the trade unions are worth so...
Order! Now then, I don't need any more from the second bench. Can I just say, please, less of it. We've had a bit of a run-in recently and I don't need to have any more. Right. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's an audacity for the honourable gentleman to stand there and suggest in some way that Labour broke promises or raised taxes. When I'll school the honourable gentleman, it was his government that raised taxes to the highest level for a generation. It was his government.
Sorry? We'll have less as well, unless you want to go and have a cup of tea. Have we heard any more? Is that it now? Yes or no? Absolutely, you're the one that was mouthing. Well, I'm sorry, you must be able to do it like a ventriloquist dummy. Prime Minister.
It was his government that crashed the economy, that saw inflation rise to 1.1% and grow flatline. It was his government that spent the reserves 3 times over. I'll take no lessons from the honourable gentleman.
Alex Burkhardt.
I understand why the right honourable lady doesn't want to answer questions about the terrible choices the government have made. It's because the truth is ugly. The truth is that this is a punishment meted out to people who don't vote Labour. It's the same punishment meted out to parents who send their children to private schools. It's the same punishment meted out to the owners of small businesses terrified about national insurance contributions. And it's the same punishment meted out to pensioners who can't afford to pay their fuel this winter. Isn't it the truth, Mr. Speaker, that if you don't vote Labour, they don't care about you?
There will be more, and it won't be what you want more of. Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, after that display, he clearly didn't recognise the result of the general election. And has learnt nothing. While this government has been fixing the mess that they left, the Conservatives have been desperately trying to rewrite history. They come here every week jumping on a new bandwagon, taking a new pot shot, but absolutely no word on what they'll do differently. Last week, the Leader of the Opposition admitted she supported Labour's plans to invest in NHS, schools and homes. But what they want is all the benefits of the budget, Mr. Speaker, but have no idea how they'll pay for it. Mr. Speaker, the faces may change, but it's the same old Tory party. Straight back to putting everything on their credit card, spending their reserves 3 times over. We took the difficult decisions to fix the £22 billion black hole that they left behind, and while they're reinventing the past, we're investing in the future.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a new report, Human Rights Watch have set out irrefutably how Israeli authorities are committing the war crimes of forcible transfer in Gaza, which amounts to crimes against humanity. Israel's evacuation system fails to ensure civilian safety. Civilians are not provided with access to health, nutrition and shelter, compounded by the banning of UNRWA, with much of Gaza now uninhabitable. Will the government acknowledge that Israel has carried out mass forced displacement in Gaza, and will it take concrete measures on arms trade and Israeli officials in order to comply with its duty to prevent genocide and protect Palestinian lives?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in the Middle East is catastrophic, and I know the whole House is horrified at the terrible loss of civilian life. We are calling at every opportunity for an immediate ceasefire with the release of the hostages and more aid into Gaza. But we do urge Israel to ensure that UNRWA can continue its life-saving work, something the Foreign Secretary has discussed directly with the Israeli Foreign Minister. And we've imposed sanctions in response to appalling incidents of settler violence and suspended export licences for arms following a review that found a clear risk that they may be used to commit or facilitate violations of international law. And we will continue to seek to a 2-state solution with a secure Israel, Mr. Speaker, alongside a viable and sovereign Palestine.
Come to Daisy Cooper, the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I associate myself and the Liberal Democrats with the Deputy Prime Minister's remarks on Ukraine? Ahead of the budget, I warned the Deputy Prime Minister that increasing national insurance contributions on social care providers would make the crisis in social care worse. Now, OBR figures suggest that the increase in NICs will cost more to social care providers than the money that the government has announced for that sector in the budget, meaning that that measure alone could withdraw £200 million out of the sector. Will the Deputy Prime Minister speak with the Chancellor to make sure that at the very least health and care providers are protected from taking the hit?
Well, I thank the honourable member for that question, and the Chancellor is sat near me, and I know that through those discussions that we had, that we wanted to ensure that we protected social care. That's why we confirmed £600 million of new grant funding for social care next year, Mr. Speaker, an uplift to local government spending, and an £86 million increase to the Disabled Facilities Grant. Our Employment Rights Bill will help deliver the first ever fair pay agreement for social care sector as well, and we'll also make sure that the NHS is funded to help with the social care situation as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that the social care providers will be worse off, so I do urge the Deputy Prime Minister and the Chancellor to look again at that. Somebody else who was very worried about the budget is Cathy. Cathy is a farmer in my constituency of St Albans, and she told me yesterday that she thinks the government changes simply do not make sense. The changes mean that her family may have to pay a bill which will force them to sell land, which makes food production unviable. At the same time, the government has not closed the land buying tax loophole that can be exploited by equity firms and the super wealthy. Farmers told me yesterday that they feel like they were betrayed by the Conservatives, and they now feel they were betrayed by the Conservatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Farmers told me yesterday that they feel as though they have been betrayed by the Conservatives, but they now feel like they have also been lied to by Labour. Will the Deputy Prime Minister think again on this measure so that our farmers can feed Britain?
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear that Cathy is distressed by what I would say is scaremongering around what the Labour Party is doing. The budget delivered £5 billion for farming over the next 2 years, a record amount. The last government failed to spend £300 million on farmers, and our plan is sensible, fair and proportionate, and protects the smaller estates while fixing public services that they rely on.
Alex Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are only 7 places in England, according to the House Library.
And that concludes the part of PMQs that we will be listening to today. You can listen to Natasha and I picking over the bones after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 12. Shall we read a random selection of texts that have come in response to that PMQs? What's his name again?
Alex Burkhardt.
Versus Angela Rayner.
The titans of British politics.
This has got to be the worst ever PMQs, writes Colin. Performance by anyone, hands down. Who is this idiot? You'd have to clarify which one you meant, Colin. This guy really comes across like he's trying too hard, says Chris. Ha 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 ha, says Shirley. Who is this ridiculous shouty person? Chris writes, another Chris. They might be insincere questions, but Rayner isn't really answering them. What a load of rubbish. Lindsay Hoyle too. What an embarrassment. Why is our politics so infantile? He sounds like he's trying very hard to be very angry. This Tory is painfully useless, says Steve. Is he seriously saying that no farmers will exist in 12 years? If that's true, then surely the businesses are screwed anyway, says Jonathan. James writes, Lars Burkhardt coming across as bloviating, essay questions and excessive ranting. This is so absolutely and absurdly appalling. Louise says, Mr. Burkhardt is my MP. He is the most lazy and ignorant person anyone could ever meet. Jason says, what an oddly angry little man. Grey little man. And George, I can't go on, but you get I'll try and find a nice one if I can. George writes, is this guy okay? I always
There's a lot of concern for Mr. Burkhardt's welfare.
Yes, there is a lot. I can't find a nice one.
Well, they're not going to be telling you.
I thought, here you go. I thought he was better than Badenoch.
There we go.
There we go.
It's always a silver lining.
They do know most weeks it was 50-50 when it was Sunak versus Starmer.
Well, he's a different vibe, isn't it? There was a distinct, mum and dad are away, and let's,
it was embarrassing. If that was someone's first ever
class.
PMQs, it was a little bit embarrassing from his side of things.
Yeah.
Why did he shout so much? Keith obviously focuses on the technical aspects. And he was shouting so loudly that the microphones were distorting, which is quite odd. Happened on this show yesterday.
Yes, I've heard. But yes, you had a vibe of the sort of teachers out of class. Let's misbehave because the parents are sort of we've got the babysitters in sort of vibe to Prime Minister's questions. Rayner, for what it was worth, she didn't seem bothered by him at all. Absolutely relaxed. I mean, she just doesn't really, got this air of just not really giving a damn about sort of anything that's being thrown at her. I do agree that she can't answer the questions. Of course she can't. She's not the Prime Minister. But she didn't really engage with, I think, anything that was being thrown at her. And I do think that frustrates listeners when they do see politicians, again, being asked reasonable questions and then they're not getting it back. But I'm not sure that Alex Burkhart's quite shouty, aggressive tone really worked against her.
This is good. From Quig. I'm not sure, this is on Blue Sky, where you can message me at Mr. James OB. I'm not sure if this guy is good at PMQs or just really good at shouting. And another one saying he's doing better than Kemi, this fella. Although Josh points out, you can tell he was a teacher.
You can tell he was a teacher, yeah. It's very much, you at the back of the classroom, you just sit down. But yes, and you had that from Hoyle as well throughout the entire thing. It was certainly a lively Prime Minister's questions, and I think it sums up everything we know about politics, doesn't it? The public absolutely hate seeing politicians scrap like this in this format, but they bloody love it, don't they? They absolutely really love taking chunks out of each other. I don't think there was any particular winner of that, though. I don't think Rayner, just by sort of leaning out, not really engaging with the question, but she's a much more seasoned professional and performer at Prime Minister's questions.
It's a strong comeback if you're asked about inflation to point out that you were the Minister for Growth when it was at 11.1%, and there's not. I mean, it was a bit. I mean, they probably
they'll go.
Predicted.
We took it down. We took it down to 2%. Whether that was we've talked about this so many times. Whether it was anything to do with the Conservative government.
Well, they claimed it was nothing to do with them when it went up, and everything to do with them when it came back down again. Whereas, in fact, neither of those.
Oh, and now I'm sure once it goes down again next year, the Labour Party will say it's all down to us and our economic plan, as indeed all politicians do.
Matthew puts it well. Angela Rayner isn't as good defensively as she was offensively in opposition for me. That must do better. But you've very neatly highlighted the difference in the task before her.
Yeah, it's completely true. And I'm not sure she did come across, as well. And talking about tax, I don't think that's quite the sort of jibe that she thinks it is. The Tories raised taxes and to record highs. You've just raised them to a new record high. I don't quite think that's a logical argument for her to go on. But she's obviously limited in what she can say at these outings when Keir Starmer is coming back from a world trip. She doesn't have the same authority. And, from everything we do read about them in the papers, they're not that close as a political, power dynamic. They don't really sort of see eye to eye on a lot of things. And obviously they do come from two completely different wings of the Labour Party. So there's not kind of a lot that she's actually able to do. It's more of a show for MPs. But there will be questions, and I'm sure MPs will be asking questions of why Keir Starmer feels that the G20 and staying late another day at the G20 was something worth missing yet another Prime Minister's questions for. Whether you think it is right to engage on the world stage and to fly around the world on so many trips. This is his 15th one that he's done since entering office. There are criticisms of that. There are some people in Number 10 privately who have told me, actually, we do need to get better at selling these to the public back home and to be talking about why we are flying around the world and what we are doing about it.
Relations, statesmanship.
Exactly, and don't think they're doing
coming back from D-Day commemorations early is probably a win as well, but now he's getting criticised for spending too much time at international. And you can't not go to NATO, you can't not go to the G20. Most of them, the meeting with Macron in France, you see them listed. That it's pretty hard to pick one that you wouldn't have gone to.
Yeah, I think there were a few that potentially he wanted to go to sort of cement relationships with people back on the world stage again and to meet people he hadn't met before. But, this is Keir Starmer's argument is we're back in business, we're back on the world stage, Britain is playing a part again. But there are a lot of problems back home. And like I say, I think people in Number 10 realise they need to be a little bit better about saying this is why we've flown to the G20. And that's why you saw when Keir Starmer was at COP last week, made a specific reference to businesses in Hull, to wind turbines, to electric power, to renewables, about how it's affecting people back home and what he's actually doing when he's on these trips on the world stage and how they can actually impact jobs here.
A couple of teachers are unhappy with us. Richard writes, "Oi, mate, what sort of a teacher are you?" "Oi, mate, I was a teacher. The trick is to use your voice effectively, not to shout your knickers off. No one will take any notice of you if you do." I bet it's a great teacher. That's to shout your knickers off. I've never heard that phrase before.
I like
that. Sorry, I just snorted. And Susan says that's a bit offensive to teachers, but she adds a couple of laughing emojis, so I don't think she's too cross with us. Is the Farmer's Landing? What do we think about that? Because that was a bit of projection there, accusing the Labour government of not caring about people that don't vote for them, which is, I mean, an odd gambit in a two-party political system. But is it landing? It's hard to tell. There have been a lot of protesters. Jeremy Clarkson very cross. but not the levels of public support that you might think they enjoyed from reading right-wing newspapers, in my opinion.
They're a very loud and noisy bunch,
Yes.
I think it's fair to say, and they obviously are attracting attention sort of in the right ways and causing a big stink. But, what other policy is uniting Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, Jeremy Clarkson, Andrew Lloyd Webber and the Liberal Democrats? Yeah. So, in effect of being such a wide-ranging policy, I think actually there is a little bit of disquiet in government about this. They've obviously been standing firm on the idea of the policy and what exactly it represents. And one source in government said to me the other day, well, actually, we're having a row about inheritance tax. Actually, for a Labour government to be having that argument, it's the one we want to have. And
Yes.
it can be quite good for us to lean into the argument that actually people have been avoiding inheritance tax. We are closing that loophole.
It is. I mean, awful lot is riding on how feasible it is that someone with a £4.5 million farm is getting by on less than the national median wage, which is a claim I've heard several times.
It is, and they are just earning nothing from it. And the profit margins for making food in this country are notoriously low and have been for a very, very long time. But equally, you do hear a lot of people saying, well, why is it okay that people like James Dyson or whoever it might be are allowed to buy up significant chunks of land? Some say with the intention of selling them off to avoid that inheritance tax in the first place. I think in terms of government, they are aware of this. Labour MPs are worried about what this would mean. I wouldn't be surprised to see some sort of shift on it. However, I don't think it's going to be a scrapping of the whole policy.
Finessing.
I could see them potentially sort of, doing something to...
I don't know how you do it.
To mitigate those impacts.
A distinction between owners and workers, those who work the land and own it, and those who own it but don't work it. But I don't know how you would do that. And speaking of ownership, I've got an author coming on the programme after the news who has written a book focusing in zoning in on the fact that half of the land in England is owned by what percentage of the population? I'm going to leave that hanging. So if this was a missing words round, it would be blank percent of the population owns half of England. So half of England is owned by what percentage of the population?
Is that all farmland or is it all land?
All of it. All of England. All of England, all the green and pleasant land, right up to and including the dark satanic mills. All right. So what percentage, what number would you put there? Have a little think about that while Amelia Cox brings you the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 33 minutes after 12, and quite a few of you got it right, actually. Mary got it right, Catherine got it right, James got it right. Mark went a bit too low. He said less than 1%, as did Adam with 0.0002%. Some people went as high as 50%. Joe said, I reckon that 50% of the population owns 50% of England. Catherine Kendall, as I said, got it right. 1% of the population owns half of England. It's a rather arresting statistic on the fly cover of Guy Shrubsole's new book. Guy, you will know, as an environmental campaigner and author, and the new book is called The Lie of the Land. It follows on from a previous book called Who Owns England, and in a sense the new book is about what they've done with what they own. Let's begin with why this is immediately problematic, Guy. There's also a Matthew Parris quote, isn't there, at the front of the book about so that the land needs to be owned if it's looked after. So is it necessarily and inevitably a bad thing to have such a huge amount of land concentrated in such a tiny proportion of the population?
Well, good to speak to you, James, and thanks for that introduction. So, yes, I mean, my book is about land ownership and how it's used. And you're right, I start with a quote from Matthew Parris saying that land has to be owned in order to be looked after. My contention is that this is one of the lies that is told about our land, which is a sort of a kind of way of deflecting away from the concentration of ownership of land in this country. It's basically this narrative that has grown up and has been told to us by groups like the Country Land and Business Association, groups like the National Farmers Union, who we obviously saw protesting yesterday, that farmers and landowners are inevitably the trusted custodians of the countryside. But this is a phrase that was deliberately used and put about as a PR term from the 1970s onwards by successive NFU presidents. Researching the book, this is what I found, that pretty much every NFU president since the 1970s has used this same phrase: we are the custodians of the countryside. And it was in order to deflect attention away from the concerns, very legitimate concerns of environmentalists and the general public of the impacts of industrialised agriculture, intensive shooting, modern forestry on our wildlife and our habitats. We've lost half of all farmland birds since 1970. That's what the custodians of the countryside have done to nature in this country.
It's an incredible contradiction of what isn't just a party line for the NFU, but it's probably seeped into public consciousness really effectively, hasn't it? It's almost unchallenged.
Massively so. And you see that in much of the media coverage of the recent protests, of the whole debacle about agricultural property relief, and portrayals of farming more generally. I think the media has portrayed a very distorted view of the countryside, how land is used and who owns it.
Well, if you see it as another embodiment of epic and often inherited wealth, then I suppose a quick glance at who owns the newspapers will give you an explanation of who and indeed why they're portraying this particular conflict in the ways that they are. And it's profoundly relevant. I mean, you didn't know when you sat down to write this book that the government was planning to remove inheritance tax on farms, but I mean, it couldn't be more relevant to a lot of the stuff that you're writing about of the betrayal, really, of that history or claim of custodianship. Who are the offenders here? Because I don't want every farmer to think everyone who owns you need to own more land than the average bear to be a farmer, don't you? So what are the most egregious examples of what you're describing?
Look, let's start with that statistic you quoted earlier, that less than 1% of the population own half of all England. So, let's dig into this a little bit more. So if you look at the official government figures, this is the DEFRA, Department for Environment figures, the June Agricultural Survey, which is brought out every year, and it's filled in by farmers and landowners themselves, you find that there's about 100,000 farms in England. And almost 60% of those farms are below 123 acres in size, 60% of them. So that gives you a sense of, wow. That's really where this sort of average farm is. At the other end of the scale, again, looking at these official stats, you can see that half the land in England is controlled by just 25,000 estates and agribusinesses. And then you start looking at the scale of some of those land holdings. You've got your Jeremy Clarksons who own 1,000 acres. That's bigger than 90% of all England, of English farms, right? You've got the head of the Country Land and Business Association who was marching alongside Jeremy Clarkson yesterday, Lady Victoria Vivian. She owns a 1,000-acre estate in Cornwall. Then you get the really big guys. You've got the dukes, for example. We have dukes in this country still.
It's an extraordinary list, isn't it, when you see that, the dukes and the earls, 20 of them I've seen assembled in one place. And these are people who can possibly trace their ownership of this land back to William the Conqueror in some cases.
Absolutely. The Duke of Westminster, for example, his family, the Grosvenors, it comes from the nickname that Hugh Grosvenor was given, who was one of the Norman barons who came over in 1066 and conquered England. And Grosvenor, it means the fat hunter. So that was what the peasants were calling their lords and masters in those days. But didn't stop him from going on to acquire a huge amount of land gifted to him by William the Conqueror after the conquest. And the Grosvenor family continue to own hundreds of thousands of acres in this country to this very day. And you've got 20 dukes who own 1 million acres of Britain. 1 million acres.
And they presumably are going to be the most aggrieved about the new policy, potentially, albeit that a lot of it will be tied up in trust and things, won't it?
I noticed that the Duchess of Rutland, I think, wrote in the Telegraph.
I thought that was a pub.
Well, this is it. This is how the aristocracy, their influence bleeds into all our culture still. It's Downton Abbey, it's the worship of stately homes, the cult of the stately home still. But no, that genuinely, real person, the Duchess of Rutland wrote in the Telegraph how upset she was about the tax changes and how she was going to have to pay more inheritance tax. But look, the aristocracy are past masters at avoiding tax. We invented trust law in this country. Some of the aristocracy were some of the first pioneers of using offshore structures, offshore companies and trusts in the 1970s to try and avoid what were then more progressive rates of taxation than we have today. So this is a long history of the very the landed wealthy trying to avoid paying their fair share of tax.
And speaking of the Country Land and Business Association, its members own 1/3 of all the land in England and Wales.
That's right, and they have maybe 25,000 members. So, again, you get this sense of how concentrated and unequal land ownership is.
And I mean, it's two prongs to this, isn't there? There's the natural injustice, the sense of injustice, the reality of injustice, but also, and the central thrust of the book, what they are doing with the land that they own. And I mean, where's the line between technological advancement and long-term damage, as it were, or long-term danger?
Well, look, of course, a huge amount of the damage that's been done to the countryside has come from the intensification of agriculture in the decade since the Second World War. But some of it goes back a bit further, and you look at some of the noble country traditions that we have in this country, traditions that are, of course, actually only date from the Victorian period. Things like grouse shooting. I mean, not many people will be aware that an area the size of Greater London is devoted to shooting grouse in England. And this is what
Say that again.
An area the size of Greater London, this is over 500,000 acres of land, is devoted to shooting red grouse in England. And there's even more of it in the Scottish Highlands, millions more acres devoted to it in the Scottish Highlands. And this is land that is owned by a few hundred estates, 150 estates in England who own this vast area of land, and they burn it. And this is one of our biggest carbon stores. Peat bogs, huge stores of carbon, really, really important in the fight against climate change, really important habitats in their own right. But they are literally set fire to each year by their owners in order to maximise the numbers of game birds that they can shoot. So you sort of think these guys have the temerity to say that they're the custodians of the countryside.
And the book is full of examples of conduct that is the polar opposite of being a custodian of the countryside. I want to make it clear, though, that you speak from a place of love. You love the countryside, and many farmers are forces for good. It's just that this week, more than any other week, the blurring of those distinctions has been it's been incredible, frankly. So, what is a good farmer? What is a farmer who we need and value and cherish, and possibly who maybe does deserve a little bit of protection from politicians sometimes?
No, absolutely. Look, I live in Devon. My grandparents were lifelong farmers. My mum grew up on the family farm, which was 100 acres, incidentally. There are amazing examples of nature-friendly farmers, the nature-friendly farming network that exists that tries to represent farmers who are doing regenerative farming, who are restoring wildlife on their farms. Farmers like James Rebanks, who has transformed, his farm in the Lake District, reduced the number of sheep, increased the number of grazing cattle, done loads to restore wildlife.
And explained it all in beautiful poetic detail as well, which is important.
Exactly. And he sort of often has also said we should call out, this whole argument about custodians of the countryside. If we're not living up to it, then, we should call it out. And, there are also great examples of, some wealthy landowners who've done the same. There are some big landowners like, the Knepp estate in Sussex, where, sort of the poster child for rewilding in this country. The thing is that I just don't think these kind of heroes can do it all by themselves.
No.
You can't just put all of the burden of restoring, these basically de-wilded isles of ours on the shoulders of just a few pioneers.
Has to be policy driven.
It has to be policy driven, and of course we have to have proper rewards. We have to have a decent system of farm payments in place. That has been reformed since we left, since Brexit. There is a new system of environmental land management payments in place. I think the budget for that actually should be bigger, considerably larger. But I also think it should be something where we are holding all landowners, particularly large landowners, more accountable for how they're spending that money and what they're doing with their land.
Go on.
Sorry.
No,
I would require all landowners who own more than 1,000 acres, the Jeremy Clarksons of this world and above, to have to report publicly on what they're doing to look after the land.
And I think yesterday we got rather embarrassed by Victoria Derbyshire interviewing him in the middle of the march, claimed that he'd only bought the farm so he could have a shoot, which tallies with quite a few of the things that you've talked about. I don't mention also James Rebanks was my guest on Full Disclosure a couple of weeks ago, and you can find out a lot more about him by listening to that. The lie of the land. There's a camera. I'm not being weird. There's a camera over there, so I'm holding up the book so you can see it. The lie of the land by Guy Shrubsole is out now. This is an unfair question sometimes to ask authors, so feel free to ignore it. But what are you setting out to do with this book?
Well, I want to help spark a conversation about land reform in England. I want us in England to look to what's happened in Scotland over the last 20 years. There's been a really, really vibrant debate about land in Scotland, about who owns it and what's it for and how do we look after it better. There's been amazing examples in Scotland of communities buying land and being given the powers to do so. There is some talk that the Labour government is going to bring forward legislation to allow that right to happen here as well. But fundamentally, this is about, I think, democracy, accountability, transparency. It's about all of us having more of a say over how land is used, and really holding to account more of the big landowners who we don't often hear about.
Maybe you're right. The Earl of Derby's
what they're doing with it.
The Earl of Derby's very unhappy about these new tax rules, isn't he? For example.
Well, let me fetch my tiny violin.
Guy Shrubsole, thank you. The Lie of the Land, as I say, is out now. And oddly, we'll have another conversation after the next junction about transparency, accountability, but of a very different order, because we'll be returning to the case of Jimmy Lai, the journalist and British citizen. He has dual citizenship, currently imprisoned by the Chinese administration for committing the crime of journalism, and some interesting developments in Jimmy's case, which his lawyer and indeed his son Sebastien will explain to us after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 1. Jimmy Lai, a British national, if there's any confusion in my mind about that a moment ago. Still imprisoned by the Chinese government and, of course, now facing trial. But the British Prime Minister raised the case in extraordinary circumstances yesterday. And I'm just going to play you that before we talk to Jimmy's son Sebastien and his lawyer, Caoilhphionn Gallagher. And you can't necessarily tell this from the footage, so I'll explain what happens as soon as this issue is raised. The Chinese authorities essentially put their hands over the cameras of journalists and bundle them out of the room. I think that gives you enough context to appreciate this clip.
I'm very pleased that my Foreign Secretary and Foreign Minister Wang met recently and discussed respective concerns, including human rights and parliamentary sanctions, Taiwan, South China Sea, and our shared interest in Hong Kong. We are concerned by reports of Jimmy Lai's deterioration health in prison. You raised the Chinese embassy building in London when we spoke on the telephone, and we have since taken action by calling in that application. Now we have to follow the legal process and timeline.
It is 12:51, and it was during that exchange in Rio de Janeiro on Monday at the G20 meeting that the journalists were essentially sort of removed from the equation by Chinese forces. As I say, Caoilhphionn Gallagher, KC, and Sebastien Lai join me now. Sebastien, I'll begin with you. How significant a development was that really for your father by Keir Starmer?
So very significant. We're incredibly grateful that he mentioned it to Xi Jinping. Obviously, the UK government's position is now that they want him to see immediately released and returned back home to the UK, and that's a step to see that happening. And
last time we spoke, you were keen to get David Lammy more involved. Has there been progress on that front as well?
Yeah, so I've since met with Foreign Secretary David Lammy. So thank you very much for putting a pressure on him through the show. He has also said in Parliament that my father's case will be raised in all ministerial levels at all bilateral engagements with China.
Caoilhphionn, the trial continues. I should say that Jimmy Lai smiled and waved to family and the public as he entered the courtroom, but he did appear to have lost weight since his arrest, which was several years ago. Just talk us through what is going on in the courtroom at the moment and what the plan is likely to be.
Yeah, so the National Security Law trial started last December, almost a year ago, was initially due to be finished by Easter of this year, but the prosecution laid out their case over 6 months, and we've now had an almost 6-month gap before the defence gets to present their case. So day one of the defence case was today. So, of course, there shouldn't have been that kind of delay, a disgraceful delay in any case, particularly here where you're dealing with a gentleman who's 77, who's diabetic, who's not doing well. We saw multiple reports today about him having lost weight and referring to him looking more frail than he had previously. We are exceptionally worried about him. And this has been foot dragging by the Hong Kong authorities simply to keep him behind bars for longer. What we saw today was Jimmy Lai being defiant and explaining why his newspaper, Apple Daily, right from the outset had core values which mattered to the people of Hong Kong and mattered to the British people. So rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. And those are the principles by which he has lived his life since 1989, since Tiananmen Square. Those are the principles which underpin his newspaper. And those principles are precisely the reason why he's being targeted in this disgraceful way by a bully state.
Did the prosecution provide any evidence of his alleged collusion with foreign forces, which was a central thrust of today's proceedings?
No, not today. So what happened in the first 6 months of the trial was the prosecution laying out their case. And there we saw later just how thin the case is. So the case against him is under the national security law, which has been widely condemned by United Nations experts, Amnesty International, the UK government, US government, European Parliament, and many others. And it's a law which shouldn't exist. And it essentially, James, criminalises dissent. So what it means is that the prosecution has been presenting evidence of him as a newspaper editor, publishing stories and publishing pieces which Beijing didn't like. And it's been presenting so-called evidence of him colluding with foreign forces, by which they mean raising human rights concerns about the deterioration of civil liberties in Hong Kong with politicians internationally and international organisations, many of whom shared those views. That's not collusion, simply that he was speaking sense, and he was speaking common sense with which many, many people globally, including our own government here in the UK, agreed.
And he explained that to the court himself today?
Yes, he did start to.
Yes.
So his questions today from the outset were about the nature of his engagement with other politicians and him talking about shining a light on what was actually happening and him highlighting reality. And that is indeed what he did in his newspaper and in his pro-democracy campaigning.
We should mention that the 45 other pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong handed sentences yesterday ranging from 4 years and 2 months right up to 10 years. This includes former legislators, councillors, academics. 2 people acquitted in May made up that group known as the Hong Kong 47. So what sort of, in real terms, what are they being locked up for?
So these are horrifying sentences, incredibly draconian, and they were prosecuted and now convicted and sentenced for exercising internationally protected rights, for attempting to maximise the prospects of success in an election by holding primaries. I mean, these are basic rights which are protected under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China purports to uphold. And the fact that we have now seen individuals receiving sentences, including a sentence of a decade, for simply exercising internationally protected rights, shows you what we're dealing with Hong Kong. And key question now is, we know, and we saw from that clip, James, that you just showed, we know that China wants to keep the world out. It does not want the world watching what is happening in Hong Kong. And we have got to be shouting from the rooftops about how disgraceful the events of this week are. And most importantly, we've got to be shouting from the rooftops about how important it is that Sebastian's father, a British national, is freed before it's too late, before we see a British national dying behind bars for exercising his internationally protected rights.
Well, indeed. And you know you've always got access to my rooftop to do all the shouting that you want. So, Sebastien, what was it like to see your dad?
It's mixed, isn't it? Because the whole goal of the Hong Kong government of putting him in solitary confinement for almost 4 years now, at his age, not giving him access to natural light, not having the ability to have the Holy Communion. It is to break him. It's to tell him that nobody cares about him, that he did all of this for nothing, that he stood in defense of freedom for nothing. And so, and his body has, in some sense, gotten much worse. His health has gotten much worse. But it was a bittersweet moment of seeing him, of hearing about him on the stand and seeing that though his body might be deteriorating, his mind and his spirit is unbroken, and I'm tremendously proud of him, of all that he has done. But I'm glad to see that he is still there. He is still fighting.
No, we all are. Thank you. Sebastien Lai, son of the imprisoned British national, imprisoned as Caoilfhionn Gallagher, KC explained so powerfully, essentially for doing actual journalism. It's coming up to 1 o'clock. Thank you. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but now on LBC, it's Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.